The Rajah's Diamond by Robert Louis Stevenson. Read by Arthur Lane. Story of the Bandbox. Up to the age of 16, at a private school, and afterwards at one of those great institutions for which England is justly famous, Mr. Harry Hartley had received the ordinary education of a gentleman. At that period, he manifested a remarkable distaste for study, and his only surviving parent being both weak and ignorant, he was permitted thenceforward to spend his time in the attainment of petty and purely elegant accomplishments. 2 years later, he was left an orphan and almost a beggar. For all active and industrious pursuits, Harry was unfitted alike by nature and training. He could sing romantic ditties and accompany himself with discretion on the piano. He was a graceful, although a timid cavalier. He had a pronounced taste for chess, and nature had sent him into the world with one of the most engaging exteriors that can well be fancied. Blonde and pink, with dove's eyes and a gentle smile, he had an air of agreeable tenderness and melancholy, and the most submissive and caressing manners. But when all is said, he was not the man to lead armaments of war or direct the councils of a state. A fortunate chance and some influence obtained for Harry, at the time of his bereavement, the position of private secretary to Major General Sir Thomas Vandeleur, C.B. Sir Thomas was a man of 60, loud-spoken, boisterous, and domineering. For some reason, some service the nature of which had been often whispered and repeatedly denied, the Rajah of Kashgar had presented this officer with the 6th known diamond of the world. The gift transformed General Vandeleur from a poor into a wealthy man, from an obscure and unpopular soldier into one of the lions of London society. The possessor of the Rajah's diamond was welcome in the most exclusive circles, and he had found a lady, young, beautiful, and well-born, who was willing to call the diamond hers, even at the price of marriage with Sir Thomas Vandeleur. It was commonly said at the time that, as like draws to like, one jewel had attracted another. Certainly Lady Vandeleur was not only a gem of the finest water in her own person, but she showed herself to the world in a very costly setting, and she was considered by many respectable authorities as one among the 3 or 4 best-dressed women in England. Harry's duty as secretary was not particularly onerous, but he had a dislike for all prolonged work. It gave him pain to ink his fingers, and the charms of Lady Vandeleur and her toilettes drew him often from the library to the boudoir. He had the prettiest ways among women, could talk fashions with enjoyment, and was never more happy than when criticizing a shade of ribbon or running on an errand to the milliner's. In short, Sir Thomas's correspondence fell into pitiful arrears, and my lady had another lady's maid. At last the general, who was one of the least patient of military commanders, arose from his place in a violent access of passion and indicated to his secretary that he had no further need for his services, with one of those explanatory gestures which are most rarely employed between gentlemen. The door being unfortunately open, Mr. Hartley fell downstairs head foremost. He arose somewhat hurt and very deeply aggrieved. The life in the general's house precisely suited him. He moved, on a more or less doubtful footing, in very genteel company. He did little, he ate of the best, and he had a lukewarm satisfaction in the presence of Lady Vandeleur, which in his own heart he dubbed by a more emphatic name. Immediately after he had been outraged by the military foot, he hurried to the boudoir and recounted his sorrows. "You know very well, my dear Harry," replied Lady Vandeleur, for she called him by name like a child or a domestic servant, "that you never by any chance do what the general tells you. No more do I, you may say, but that is different. A woman can earn her pardon for a good year of disobedience by a single adroit submission, and besides, no one is married to his private secretary. I shall be sorry to lose you, but since you cannot stay longer in a house where you have been insulted, I shall wish you goodbye, and I promise you to make the general smart for his behaviour." Harry's countenance fell, tears came into his eyes, and he gazed on Lady Vandeleur with a tender reproach. "My lady," said he, "what is an insult? I should think little indeed of anyone who could not forgive them by the score. But to leave one's friends, to tear up the bonds of affection—" He was unable to continue, for his emotion choked him, and he began to weep. Lady Vandeleur looked at him with a curious expression. "This little fool," she thought, "imagines himself to be in love with me. Why should he not become my servant instead of the general's? He is good-natured, obliging, and understands dress, and besides it will keep him out of mischief. He is positively too pretty to be unattached. That night she talked over the general, who was already somewhat ashamed of his vivacity, and Harry was transferred to the feminine department, where his life was little short of heavenly. He was always dressed with uncommon nicety, wore delicate flowers in his buttonhole, and could entertain a visitor with tact and pleasantry. He took a pride in civility to a beautiful woman, received Lady Vandeleur's commands as so many marks of favour, and was pleased to exhibit himself before other men, who derided and despised him, in his character of male lady's maid and man milliner. Nor could he think enough of his existence from a moral point of view. Wickedness seemed to him an essentially male attribute, and to pass one's days with a delicate woman, and principally occupied about trimmings, was to inhabit an enchanted isle among the storms of life. One fine morning he came into the drawing-room and began to arrange some music on the top of the piano. Lady Vandeleur, at the other end of the apartment, was speaking somewhat eagerly with her brother, Charlie Pendragon, an elderly young man, much broken with dissipation, and very lame of one foot. The private secretary, to whose entrance they paid no regard, could not avoid overhearing a part of their conversation. "Today or never," said the lady, "once and for all, it shall be done today." "Today, if it must be," replied the brother with a sigh. "But it is a false step, a ruinous step, Clara, and we shall live to repent it dismally." Lady Vandeleur looked her brother steadily and somewhat strangely in the face. "You forget," she said. "The man must die at last." "Upon my word, Clara," said Pendragon, "I believe you are the most heartless rascal in England." "You men," she returned, "are so coarsely built that you can never appreciate a shade of meaning. You are yourselves rapacious, violent, immodest, careless of distinction, and yet the least thought for the future shocks you in a woman. I have no patience with such stuff. You would despise in a common banker the imbecility that you expect to find in us." "You are very likely right," replied her brother. "You were always cleverer than I. And anyway, you know my motto, the family before all." "Yes, Charlie," she returned, taking his hand in hers. "I know your motto better than you know it yourself. And Clara, before the family. Is not that the second part of it? Indeed, you are the best of brothers, and I love you dearly." Mr. Pendragon got up, looking a little confused by these family endearments. "I had better not be seen," said he. "I understand my part to a miracle, and I'll keep an eye on the tame cat." "Do," she replied. "He is an abject creature, and might ruin all." She kissed the tips of her fingers to him daintily, and the brother withdrew by the boudoir and the back stair. "Harry," said Lady Vandeleur, turning towards the secretary as soon as they were alone, "I have a commission for you this morning, but you shall take a cab. I cannot have my secretary freckled." She spoke the last words with emphasis and a look of half-motherly pride that caused great contentment to poor Harry, and he professed himself charmed to find an opportunity of serving her. "It is another of our great secrets," she went on archly, "and no one must know of it but my secretary and me. Sir Thomas would make the saddest disturbance, and if you only knew how weary I am of these scenes. Oh, Harry, Harry, can you explain to me what makes you men so violent and unjust? But indeed I know you cannot. You are the only man in the world who knows nothing of these shameful passions. You are so good, Harry, and so kind. You, at least, can be a woman's friend. And do you know? I think you make the others more ugly by comparison." "It is you," said Harry gallantly, "who are so kind to me. You treat me like—" "Like a mother," interposed Lady Vandeleur. "I try to be a mother to you. Or at least," she corrected herself with a smile, "almost a mother. I'm afraid I am too young to be your mother, really. Let us say a friend, a dear friend." She paused long enough to let her words take effect in Harry's sentimental quarters, but not long enough to allow him a reply. "But all this is beside our purpose," she resumed. "You will find a bandbox in the left-hand side of the oak wardrobe. It is underneath the pink slip that I wore on Wednesday with my Mechlin. You will take it immediately to this address," and she gave him a paper. "But do not, on any account, let it out of your hands until you have received a receipt written by myself. Do you understand? Answer, if you please. Answer. This is extremely important, and I must ask you to pay some attention." Harry pacified her by repeating her instructions perfectly, and she was just going to tell him more when General Vandeleur flung into the apartment, scarlet with anger, and holding a long and elaborate milliner's bill in his hand. "Will you look at this, madam?" cried he. "Will you have the goodness to look at this document? I know well enough you married me for my money, and I hope I can make as great allowances as any other man in the service. But, as sure as God made me, I mean to put a period to this disreputable prodigality." "Mr. Hartley," said Lady Vandeleur, "I think you understand what you have to do. May I ask you to see to it at once?" "Stop," said the General, addressing Harry. "One word before you go." And then, turning again to Lady Vandeleur, "What is this precious fellow's errand?" he demanded. "I trust him no further than I do yourself, let me tell you. If he had as much as the rudiments of honesty, he would scorn to stay in this house, and what he does for his wages is a mystery to all the world. What is his errand, madam, and why are you hurrying him away?" "I supposed you had something to say to me in private," replied the lady. "You spoke about an errand," insisted the General. "Do not attempt to deceive me in my present state of temper. You certainly spoke about an errand." "If you insist on making your servants privy to our humiliating dissensions," replied Lady Vandeleur, "perhaps I had better ask Mr. Hartley to sit down." "No," she continued. "Then you may go, Mr. Hartley. I trust you may remember all that you have heard in this room. It may be useful to you." Harry at once made his escape from the drawing-room, and as he ran upstairs he could hear the General's voice upraised in declamation, and the thin tones of Lady Vandeleur planting icy repartees at every opening. How cordially he admired the wife, how skillfully she could evade an awkward question, with what secure effrontery she repeated her instructions under the very guns of the enemy, and on the other hand, how he detested the husband. There had been nothing unfamiliar in the morning's events, for he was continually in the habit of serving Lady Vandeleur on secret missions, principally connected with millinery. There was a skeleton in the house, as he well knew. The bottomless extravagance and the unknown liabilities of the wife had long since swallowed her own fortune, and threatened day by day to engulf that of the husband. Once or twice in every year, exposure and ruin seemed imminent, and Harry kept trotting round to all sorts of furnishers' shops, telling small fibs and paying small advances on the gross amount, until another term was tided over, and the lady and her faithful secretary breathed again. For Harry, in a double capacity, was heart and soul upon that side of the war. Not only did he adore Lady Vandeleur and fear and dislike her husband, but he naturally sympathized with the love of finery, and his own single extravagance was at the tailor's. He found the bandbox where it had been described, arranged his toilette with care, and left the house. The sun shone brightly, the distance he had to travel was considerable, and he remembered with dismay that the General's sudden eruption had prevented Lady Vandeleur from giving him money for a cab. On this sultry day, there was every chance that his complexion would suffer severely, and to walk through so much of London with a bandbox on his arm was a humiliation almost insupportable to a youth of his character. He paused and took counsel with himself. The Vandeleurs lived in Eaton Place. His destination was near Notting Hill. Plainly he might cross the park by keeping well in the open and avoiding populous alleys, and he thanked his stars when he reflected that it was still comparatively early in the day. Anxious to be rid of his incubus, he walked somewhat faster than his ordinary, and he was already some way through Kensington Gardens when, in a solitary spot among trees, he found himself confronted by the General. "I beg your pardon, Sir Thomas," observed Harry, politely falling on one side, for the other stood directly in his path. "Where are you going, sir?" asked the General. "I'm taking a little walk among the trees," replied the lad. The General struck the bandbox with his cane. "With that thing?" he cried. "You lie, sir, and you know you lie." "Indeed, Sir Thomas," returned Harry, "I'm not accustomed to be questioned in so high a key." "You do not understand your position," said the General. "You are my servant, and a servant of whom I have conceived the most serious suspicions. How do I know but that your box is full of teaspoons?" "It contains a silk hat belonging to a friend," said Harry. "Very well," replied General Vandeleur. "Then I want to see your friend's silk hat. I have," he added grimly, "a singular curiosity for hats, and I believe you know me to be somewhat positive." "I beg your pardon, Sir Thomas. I'm exceedingly grieved," Harry apologized. "But indeed this is a private affair." The General caught him roughly by the shoulder with one hand, while he raised his cane in the most menacing manner with the other. Harry gave himself up for lost. But at the same moment, heaven vouchsafed him an unexpected defender in the person of Charlie Pendragon, who now strode forward from behind the trees. "Come, come, General, hold your hand," said he. "This is neither courteous nor manly." "Aha!" cried the General, wheeling round upon his new antagonist. "Mr. Pendragon! And do you suppose, Mr. Pendragon, that because I have had the misfortune to marry your sister, I shall suffer myself to be dogged and thwarted by a discredited and bankrupt libertine like you? My acquaintance with Lady Vandeleur, sir, has taken away all my appetite for the other members of her family." "And do you fancy, General Vandeleur," retorted Charlie, "that because my sister has had the misfortune to marry you, she there and then forfeited her rights and privileges as a lady? I own, sir, that by that action she did as much as anybody could to derogate from her position, but to me she is still a Pendragon. I make it my business to protect her from ungentlemanly outrage, and if you were 10 times her husband, I would not permit her liberty to be restrained, nor her private messengers to be violently arrested." "How is that, Mr. Hartley?" interrogated the General. "Mr. Pendragon is of my opinion, it appears. He too suspects that Lady Vandeleur has something to do with your friend's silk hat." Charlie saw that he had committed an unpardonable blunder, which he hastened to repair. "How, sir?" he cried. "I suspect, do you say? I suspect nothing. Only where I find strength abused and a man brutalizing his inferiors, I take the liberty to interfere." As he said these words, he made a sign to Harry, which the latter was too dull or too much troubled to understand. "In what way am I to construe your attitude, sir?" demanded Vandeleur. "Why, sir, as you please," returned Pendragon. The General once more raised his cane and made a cut for Charlie's head, but the latter, lame foot and all, evaded the blow with his umbrella, ran in, and immediately closed with his formidable adversary. "Run, Harry, run!" he cried. "Run, you dolt!" Harry stood petrified for a moment, watching the two men sway together in this fierce embrace. Then he turned and took to his heels. When he cast a glance over his shoulder, he saw the General prostrate under Charlie's knee, but still making desperate efforts to reverse the situation. And the gardens seemed to have filled with people who were running from all directions towards the scene of fight. This spectacle lent the secretary wings, and he did not relax his pace until he had gained the Bayswater Road and plunged at random into an unfrequented by-street. To see 2 gentlemen of his acquaintance thus brutally mauling each other was deeply shocking to Harry. He desired to forget the sight. He desired, above all, to put as great a distance as possible between himself and General Vandeleur, and in his eagerness for this, he forgot everything about his destination, and hurried before him headlong and trembling. When he remembered that Lady Vandeleur was the wife of one and the sister of the other of these gladiators, his heart was touched with sympathy for a woman so distressingly misplaced in life. Even his own situation in the General's household looked hardly so pleasing as usual in the light of these violent transactions. He had walked some little distance, busied with these meditations, before a slight collision with another passenger reminded him of the bandbox on his arm. "Heavens!" cried he. "Where was my head? And whither have I wandered?" Thereupon he consulted the envelope which Lady Vandeleur had given him. The address was there, but without a name. Harry was simply directed to ask for the gentleman who expected a parcel from Lady Vandeleur, and if he were not at home to await his return. The gentleman, added the note, should present a receipt in the handwriting of the lady herself. All this seemed mightily mysterious, and Harry was above all astonished at the omission of the name and the formality of the receipt. He had thought little of this last when he heard it dropped in conversation, but reading it in cold blood and taking it in connection with the other strange particulars, he became convinced that he was engaged in perilous affairs. For half a moment he had a doubt of Lady Vandeleur herself, for he found these obscure proceedings somewhat unworthy of so high a lady, and became more critical when her secrets were preserved against himself. But her empire over his spirit was too complete. He dismissed his suspicions and blamed himself roundly for having so much as entertained them. In one thing, however, his duty and interest, his generosity and his terrors, coincided to get rid of the bandbox with the greatest possible dispatch. He accosted the first policeman and courteously inquired his way. It turned out that he was already not far from his destination, and a walk of a few minutes brought him to a small house in a lane, freshly painted, and kept with the most scrupulous attention. The knocker and bell pull were highly polished, Flowering pot herbs garnished the sills of the different windows, and curtains of some rich material concealed the interior from the eyes of curious passengers. The place had an air of repose and secrecy, and Harry was so far caught with this spirit that he knocked with more than usual discretion, and was more than usually careful to remove all impurity from his boots. A servant maid of some personal attractions immediately opened the door, and seemed to regard the secretary with no unkind eyes. "This is the parcel from Lady Vandeleur," said Harry. "I know," replied the maid with a nod, "but the gentleman is from home. Will you leave it with me?" "I cannot," answered Harry. "I am directed not to part with it, but upon a certain condition, and I must ask you, I'm afraid, to let me wait." "Well," said she, "I suppose I may let you wait. I am lonely enough, I can tell you, and you do not look as though you would eat a girl. But be sure and do not ask the gentleman's name, for that I am not to tell you." "Do you say so?" cried Harry. "Why, how strange. But indeed for some time back I walk among surprises. One question I think I may surely ask without indiscretion. Is he the master of this house?" "He is a lodger, and not 8 days old at that," returned the maid. "And now a question for a question. Do you know Lady Vandeleur?" "I am her private secretary," replied Harry with a glow of modest pride. "She is pretty, is she not?" pursued the servant. "Oh, beautiful," cried Harry. "Wonderfully lovely, and not less good and kind." "You look kind enough yourself," she retorted, "and I wager you are worth a dozen Lady Vandeleurs." Harry was properly scandalized. "I," he cried, "I'm only a secretary." "Do you mean that for me?" said the girl. "Because I am only a housemaid, if you please." And then, relenting at the sight of Harry's obvious confusion, "I know you mean nothing of the sort," she added, "and I like your looks, but I think nothing of your Lady Vandeleur. Oh, these mistresses," she cried, "to send out a real gentleman like you, with a bandbox, in broad day." During this talk they had remained in their original positions, she on the doorstep, he on the sidewalk, bareheaded for the sake of coolness, and with the bandbox on his arm. But upon this last speech, Harry, who was unable to support such point-blank compliments to his appearance, nor the encouraging look with which they were accompanied, began to change his attitude and glance from left to right in perturbation. In so doing, he turned his face towards the lower end of the lane, and there, to his indescribable dismay, his eyes encountered those of General Vandeleur. The general, in a prodigious fluster of heat, hurry, and indignation, had been scouring the streets in chase of his brother-in-law. But so soon as he caught a glimpse of the delinquent secretary, his purpose changed. His anger flowed into a new channel, and he turned on his heel and came tearing up the lane with truculent gestures and vociferations. Harry made but one bolt of it into the house, driving the maid before him, and the door was slammed in his pursuer's countenance. "Is there a bar? Will it lock?" asked Harry, while a salvo on the knocker made the house echo from wall to wall. "Why, what is wrong with you?" asked the maid. "Is it this old gentleman?" "If he gets hold of me," whispered Harry, "I am as good as dead. He has been pursuing me all day, carries a sword stick, and is an Indian military officer." "These are fine manners," cried the maid. "And what, if you please, may be his name?" "It is the general, my master," answered Harry. "He is after this bandbox." "Did not I tell you?" cried the maid in triumph. "I told you I thought worse than nothing of your Lady Vandeleur, and if you had an eye in your head you might see what she is for yourself. An ungrateful minx, I will be bound for that." The general renewed his attack upon the knocker, and his passion growing with delay began to kick and beat upon the panels of the door. "It is lucky," observed the girl, "that I am alone in the house. Your general may hammer until he is weary, and there is none to open for him. Follow me." So saying, she led Harry into the kitchen, where she made him sit down, and stood by him herself in an affectionate attitude, with a hand upon his shoulder. The din at the door, so far from abating, continued to increase in volume, and at each blow the unhappy secretary was shaken to the heart. "What is your name?" asked the girl. "Harry Hartley," he replied. "Mine," she went on, "is Prudence. Do you like it?" "Very much," said Harry. "But hear for a moment how the general beats upon the door. He will certainly break it in, and then in heaven's name what have I to look for but death?" "You put yourself very much about with no occasion," answered Prudence. "Let your general knock. He will do no more than blister his hands. Do you think I would keep you here if I were not sure to save you? Oh no, I am a good friend to those that please me, and we have a back door upon another lane. But, she added, checking him, for he had got upon his feet immediately on this welcome news, but I will not show where it is unless you kiss me. Will you, Harry? That I will, he cried, remembering his gallantry, not for your back door, but because you are good and pretty. And he administered 2 or 3 cordial salutes, which were returned to him in kind. Then Prudence led him to the back gate and put her hand upon the key. Will you come and see me? She asked. I will indeed, said Harry. Do not I owe you my life? And now, she added, opening the door, run as hard as you can, for I shall let in the general. Harry scarcely required this advice. Fear had him by the forelock, and he addressed himself diligently to flight. A few steps, and he believed he would escape from his trials and return to Lady Vandeleur in honour and safety. But these few steps had not been taken before he heard a man's voice hailing him by name with many execrations, and looking over his shoulder, he beheld Charlie Pendragon waving him with both arms to return. The shock of this new incident was so sudden and profound, and Harry was already worked into so high a state of nervous tension that he could think of nothing better than to accelerate his pace and continue running. He should certainly have remembered the scene in Kensington Gardens. He should certainly have concluded that, where the general was his enemy, Charlie Pendragon could be no other than a friend. But such was the fever and perturbation of his mind that he was struck by none of these considerations, and only continued to run the faster up the lane. Charlie, by the sound of his voice and the vile terms that he hurled after the secretary, was obviously beside himself with rage. He too ran his very best. But try as he might, the physical advantages were not upon his side, and his outcries and the fall of his lame foot on the macadam began to fall farther and farther into the wake. Harry's hopes began once more to arise. The lane was both steep and narrow, but it was exceedingly solitary, bordered on either hand by garden walls, overhung with foliage, and for as far as the fugitive could see in front of him, there was neither a creature moving nor an open door. Providence, weary of persecution, was now offering him an open field for his escape. Alas, as he came abreast of a garden door under a tuft of chestnuts, it was suddenly drawn back, and he could see inside upon a garden path the figure of a butcher's boy with his tray upon his arm. He had hardly recognized the fact before he was some steps beyond upon the other side. But the fellow had had time to observe him. He was evidently much surprised to see a gentleman go by at so unusual a pace, and he came out into the lane and began to call after Harry with shouts of ironical encouragement. His appearance gave a new idea to Charlie Pendragon, who, although he was now sadly out of breath, once more upraised his voice. "Stop, thief!" he cried. And immediately the butcher's boy had taken up the cry and joined in the pursuit. This was a bitter moment for the hunted secretary. It is true that his terror enabled him once more to improve his pace and gain with every step on his pursuers, but he was well aware that he was near the end of his resources, and should he meet anyone coming the other way, his predicament in the narrow lane would be desperate indeed. I must find a place of concealment, he thought, and that within the next few seconds, or all is over with me in this world. Scarcely had the thought crossed his mind than the lane took a sudden turning, and he found himself hidden from his enemies. There are circumstances in which even the least energetic of mankind learn to behave with vigour and decision, and the most cautious forget their prudence and embrace foolhardy resolutions. This was one of those occasions for Harry Hartley, and those who knew him best would have been the most astonished at the lad's audacity. He stopped dead, flung the bandbox over a garden wall, and leaping upward with incredible agility and seizing the copestone with his hands, he tumbled headlong after it into the garden. He came to himself a moment afterwards, seated in a border of small rose bushes. His hands and knees were cut and bleeding, for the wall had been protected against such an escalade by a liberal provision of old bottles, and he was conscious of a general dislocation and a painful swimming in the head. Facing him across the garden, which was in admirable order and set with flowers of the most delicious perfume, he beheld the back of a house. It was of considerable extent and plainly habitable, but in odd contrast to the grounds it was crazy, ill-kept, and of a mean appearance. On all other sides, the circuit of the garden wall appeared unbroken. He took in these features of the scene with mechanical glances, but his mind was still unable to piece together or draw a rational conclusion from what he saw. And when he heard footsteps advancing on the gravel, although he turned his eyes in that direction, it was with no thought either for defense or flight. The newcomer was a large, coarse, and very sordid personage, in gardening clothes, and with a watering pot in his left hand. One less confused would have been affected with some alarm at the sight of this man's huge proportions and black and lowering eyes. But Harry was too gravely shaken by his fall to be so much as terrified. And if he was unable to divert his glances from the gardener, he remained absolutely passive, and suffered him to draw near, to take him by the shoulder, and to plant him roughly on his feet, without a motion of resistance. For a moment, the two stared into each other's eyes, Harry fascinated, the man filled with wrath and a cruel, sneering humour. "Who are you?" he demanded at last. "Who are you to come flying over my wall and break my gloire de Dijon? What is your name?" he added, shaking him, "and what may be your business here?" Harry could not as much as proffer a word in explanation. But just at that moment, Pendragon and the butcher's boy went clumping past, and the sound of their feet and their hoarse cries echoed loudly in the narrow lane. The gardener had received his answer, and he looked down into Harry's face with an obnoxious smile. "A thief," he said. "Upon my word, and a very good thing you must make of it, for I see you dressed like a gentleman from top to toe. Are you not ashamed to go about the world in such a trim, with honest folk, I dare say, glad to buy your cast-off finery second-hand? Speak up, you dog," the man went on. "You can understand English, I suppose, and I mean to have a bit of talk with you before I march you to the station." "Indeed, sir," said Harry, "this is all a dreadful misconception, and if you will go with me to Sir Thomas Vandeleur's in Eaton Place, I can promise that all will be made plain. The most upright person, as I now perceive, can be led into suspicious positions." "My little man," replied the gardener, "I will go with you no farther than the station house in the next street. The inspector, no doubt, will be glad to take a stroll with you as far as Eaton Place, and have a bit of afternoon tea with your great acquaintances. Or would you prefer to go direct to the Home Secretary? Sir Thomas Vandeleur, indeed. Perhaps you think I don't know a gentleman when I see one, from a common run-the-hedge like you. Clothes or no clothes, I can read you like a book. Here is a shirt that maybe cost as much as my Sunday hat, and that coat, I take it, has never seen the inside of Ragfair, and then your boots." The man, whose eyes had fallen upon the ground, stopped short in his insulting commentary, and remained for a moment looking intently upon something at his feet. When he spoke, his voice was strangely altered. "What in God's name," said he, "is all this?" Harry, following the direction of the man's eyes, beheld a spectacle that struck him dumb with terror and amazement. In his fall, he had descended vertically upon the bandbox and burst it open from end to end. Thence a great treasure of diamonds had poured forth, and now lay abroad, part trodden in the soil, part scattered on the surface in regal and glittering profusion. There was a magnificent coronet, which he had often admired on Lady Vandeleur. There were rings and brooches, eardrops and bracelets, and even unset brilliants rolling here and there among the rose bushes like drops of morning dew. A princely fortune lay between the two men upon the ground, a fortune in the most inviting, solid and durable form, capable of being carried in an apron, beautiful in itself, and scattering the sunlight in a million rainbow flashes. "Good God," said Harry, "I am lost." His mind raced backwards into the past with the incalculable velocity of thought, and he began to comprehend his day's adventures, to conceive them as a whole, and to recognize the sad imbroglio in which his own character and fortunes had become involved. He looked round him as if for help, but he was alone in the garden, with his scattered diamonds and his redoubtable interlocutor, and when he gave ear, there was no sound but the rustle of the leaves and the hurried pulsation of his heart. It was little wonder if the young man felt himself deserted by his spirits, and with a broken voice repeated his last ejaculation, "I am lost." The gardener peered in all directions with an air of guilt, but there was no face at any of the windows, and he seemed to breathe again. "Pick up a heart," he said. "You fool. The worst of it is done. Why could you not say at first there was enough for two? 2? He repeated. "Aye, and for 200. But come away from here, where we may be observed, and for the love of wisdom, straighten out your hat and brush your clothes. You could not travel 2 steps the figure of fun you look just now." While Harry mechanically adopted these suggestions, the gardener, getting upon his knees, hastily drew together the scattered jewels and returned them to the bandbox. The touch of these costly crystals sent a shiver of emotion through the man's stalwart frame. His face was transfigured, and his eyes shone with concupiscence. Indeed, it seemed as if he luxuriously prolonged his occupation and dallied with every diamond that he handled. At last, however, it was done, and concealing the bandbox in his smock, the gardener beckoned to Harry and preceded him in the direction of the house. Near the door, they were met by a young man, evidently in holy orders, dark and strikingly handsome, with a look of mingled weakness and resolution, and very neatly attired after the manner of his caste. The gardener was plainly annoyed by this encounter, but he put as good a face upon it as he could, and accosted the clergyman with an obsequious and smiling air. "Here is a fine afternoon, Mr. Rolls," said he, "a fine afternoon, as sure as God made it. And here is a young friend of mine who had a fancy to look at my roses. I took the liberty to bring him in, for I thought none of the lodgers would object." "Speaking for myself," replied the Reverend Mr. Rolls, "I do not, nor do I fancy any of the rest of us would be more difficult upon so small a matter. The garden is your own, Mr. Raeburn. We must none of us forget that, and because you give us liberty to walk there, we should be indeed ungracious if we so far presumed upon your politeness as to interfere with the convenience of your friends. But, on second thoughts," he added, "I believe that this gentleman and I have met before. Mr. Hartley, I think. I regret to observe that you have had a fall." And he offered his hand. A sort of maiden dignity and a desire to delay as long as possible the necessity for explanation moved Harry to refuse this chance of help and to deny his own identity. He chose the tender mercies of the gardener, who was at least unknown to him, rather than the curiosity and perhaps the doubts of an acquaintance. "I fear there is some mistake," said he. "My name is Tomlinson, and I am a friend of Mr. Raeburn's." "Indeed," said Mr. Rolls, "the likeness is amazing." Mr. Raeburn, who had been upon thorns throughout this colloquy, now felt it high time to bring it to a period. "I wish you a pleasant saunter, sir," said he. And with that, he dragged Harry after him into the house, and then into a chamber on the garden. His first care was to draw down the blind, for Mr. Rolls still remained where they had left him, in an attitude of perplexity and thought. Then he emptied the broken bandbox on the table, and stood before the treasure, thus fully displayed, with an expression of rapturous greed, and rubbing his hands upon his thighs. For Harry, the sight of the man's face under the influence of this base emotion added another pang to those he was already suffering. It seemed incredible that, from his life of pure and delicate trifling, he should be plunged in a breath among sordid and criminal relations. He could reproach his conscience with no sinful act, and yet he was now suffering the punishment of sin in its most acute and cruel forms, the dread of punishment, the suspicions of the good, and the companionship and contamination of vile and brutal natures. He felt he could lay his life down with gladness to escape from the room and the society of Mr. Raeburn. "And now," said the latter, after he had separated the jewels into two nearly equal parts and drawn one of them nearer to himself. "And now," said he, "everything in this world has to be paid for, and some things sweetly. You must know, Mr. Hartley, if such be your name, that I am a man of a very easy temper, and good nature has been my stumbling block from first to last. I could pocket the whole of these pretty pebbles if I chose, and I should like to see you dare to say a word. But I think I must have taken a liking to you, for I declare I have not the heart to shave you so close. So, do you see, in pure kind feeling, I propose that we divide, and these," indicating the two heaps, "are the proportions that seem to me just and friendly. Do you see any objection, Mr. Hartley, may I ask? I am not the man to stick upon a brooch." "But, sir," cried Harry, "what you propose to me is impossible. The jewels are not mine, and I cannot share what is another's, no matter with whom, nor in what proportions." "They are not yours, are they not?" returned Raeburn. "And you could not share them with anybody, couldn't you? Well now, that is what I call a pity. For here am I obliged to take you to the station. The police. Think of that," he continued. "Think of the disgrace for your respectable parents. Think," he went on, taking Harry by the wrist, "think of the colonies and the day of judgment." "I cannot help it," wailed Harry. "It is not my fault. You will not come with me to Eaton Place?" "No," replied the man. "I will not, that is certain. and I mean to divide these playthings with you here." And so saying, he applied a sudden and severe torsion to the lad's wrist. Harry could not suppress a scream, and the perspiration burst forth upon his face. Perhaps pain and terror quickened his intelligence, but certainly at that moment the whole business flashed across him in another light, and he saw that there was nothing for it but to accede to the ruffian's proposal, and trust to find the house and force him to disgorge under more favourable circumstances, and when he himself was clear from all suspicion. "I agree," he said. "There is a lamb," sneered the gardener. "I thought you would recognise your interests at last. This bandbox," he continued, "I shall burn with my rubbish. It is a thing that curious folk might recognise, and as for you, scrape up your gaieties and put them in your pocket." Harry proceeded to obey, Rayburn watching him, and every now and again his greed rekindled by some bright scintillation, abstracting another jewel from the secretary's share, and adding it to his own. When this was finished, both proceeded to the front door, which Rayburn cautiously opened to observe the street. This was apparently clear of passengers, for he suddenly seized Harry by the nape of the neck, and holding his face downward so that he could see nothing but the roadway and the doorsteps of the houses, pushed him violently before him down one street and up another, for the space of perhaps a minute and a half. Harry had counted 3 corners before the bully relaxed his grasp, and crying, "Now be off with you," sent the lad flying head foremost with a well-directed and athletic kick. When Harry gathered himself up, half stunned and bleeding freely at the nose, Mr. Rayburn had entirely disappeared. For the first time, anger and pain so completely overcame the lad's spirits that he burst into a fit of tears and remained sobbing in the middle of the road. After he had thus somewhat assuaged his emotion, he began to look about him and read the names of the streets at whose intersection he had been deserted by the gardener. He was still in an unfrequented portion of West London, among villas and large gardens, but he could see some persons at a window who had evidently witnessed his misfortune, and almost immediately after a servant came running from the house and offered him a glass of water. At the same time, a dirty rogue, who had been slouching somewhere in the neighbourhood, drew near him from the other side. "Poor fellow," said the maid. "How vilely you have been handled, to be sure. Why, your knees are all cut and your clothes ruined. Do you know the wretch who used you so?" "That I do," cried Harry, who was somewhat refreshed by the water, "and shall run him home in spite of his precautions. He shall pay dearly for this day's work, I promise you." "You had better come into the house and have yourself washed and brushed," continued the maid. "My mistress will make you welcome, never fear, and see, I will pick up your hat. Why, love of mercy," she screamed, "if you have not dropped diamonds all over the street." Such was the case. A good half of what remained to him after the depredations of Mr. Rayburn had been shaken out of his pockets by the somersault, and once more lay glittering on the ground. He blessed his fortune that the maid had been so quick of eye. There is nothing so bad but it might be worse, thought he, and the recovery of these few seemed to him almost as great an affair as the loss of all the rest. But alas, as he stooped to pick up his treasures, the loiterer made a rapid onslaught, overset both Harry and the maid with a movement of his arms, swept up a double handful of the diamonds, and made off along the street with an amazing swiftness. Harry, as soon as he could get upon his feet, gave chase to the miscreant with many cries, but the latter was too fleet of foot, and probably too well acquainted with the locality. For turn where the pursuer would he could find no traces of the fugitive. In the deepest despondency, Harry revisited the scene of his mishap, where the maid, who was still waiting, very honestly returned him his hat and the remainder of the fallen diamonds. Harry thanked her from his heart, and being now in no humour for economy, made his way to the nearest cab stand and set off for Eaton Place by coach. The house, on his arrival, seemed in some confusion, as if a catastrophe had happened in the family, and the servants clustered together in the hall, and were unable, or perhaps not altogether anxious, to suppress their merriment at the tatterdemalion figure of the secretary. He passed them with as good an air of dignity as he could assume, and made directly for the boudoir. When he opened the door, an astonishing and even menacing spectacle presented itself to his eyes, for he beheld the General and his wife, and of all people, Charlie Pendragon, closeted together and speaking with earnestness and gravity on some important subject. Harry saw at once that there was little left for him to explain. Plenary confession had plainly been made to the General of the intended fraud upon his pocket, and the unfortunate miscarriage of the scheme, and they had all made common cause against a common danger. "Thank heaven!" cried Lady Vandeleur. "Here he is! The bandbox, Harry! The bandbox!" But Harry stood before them silent and downcast. "Speak!" she cried. "Speak! Where is the bandbox?" And the men, with threatening gestures, repeated the demand. Harry drew a handful of jewels from his pocket. He was very white. "This is all that remains," said he. "I declare before heaven it was through no fault of mine. And if you will have patience, although some are lost, I am afraid, forever, others, I am sure, may be still recovered." "Alas!" cried Lady Vandeleur. "All our diamonds are gone, and I owe £90,000 for dress." "Madam," said the General, "you might have paved the gutter with your own trash. You might have made debts to 50 times the sum you mention. You might have robbed me of my mother's coronet and ring, and nature might have still so far prevailed that I could have forgiven you at last. But, madam, you have taken the Rajah's diamond, the eye of light, as the Orientals poetically termed it, the pride of Kashgar. You have taken from me the Rajah's diamond," he cried, raising his hands, "and all, madam, all is at an end between us." "Believe me, General Vandeleur," she replied, "that is one of the most agreeable speeches that ever I heard from your lips, and since we are to be ruined, I could almost welcome the change if it delivers me from you. You have told me often enough that I married you for your money. Let me tell you now that I always bitterly repented the bargain, and if you were still marriageable, and had a diamond bigger than your head, I should counsel even my maid against a union so uninviting and disastrous. As for you, Mr. Hartley," she continued, turning on the secretary, "you have sufficiently exhibited your valuable qualities in this house. We are now persuaded that you equally lack manhood, sense, and self-respect, and I can see only one course open for you, to withdraw instanter, and if possible, return no more. For your wages you may rank as a creditor in my late husband's bankruptcy." Harry had scarcely comprehended this insulting address before the General was down upon him with another. "And in the meantime," said that personage, "follow me before the nearest inspector of police. You may impose upon a simple-minded soldier, sir, but the eye of the law will read your disreputable secret. If I must spend my old age in poverty through your underhand intriguing with my wife, I mean at least that you shall not remain unpunished for your pains, and God, sir, will deny me a very considerable satisfaction if you do not pick oakum from now until your dying day." With that, the General dragged Harry from the apartment and hurried him downstairs and along the street to the police station of the district. Here, says my Arabian author, ended this deplorable business of the bandbox. But to the unfortunate secretary the whole affair was the beginning of a new and manlier life. The police were easily persuaded of his innocence, and, after he'd given what help he could in the subsequent investigations, he was even complimented by one of the chiefs of the detective department on the probity and simplicity of his behavior. Several persons interested themselves in one so unfortunate, and soon after he inherited a sum of money from a maiden aunt in Worcestershire. With this he married Prudence and set sail for Bendigo, or according to another account, for Trincomalee, exceedingly content and will the best of prospects. Story of the young man in holy orders. The Reverend Mr. Simon Rolls had distinguished himself in the moral sciences and was more than usually proficient in the study of divinity. His essay on the Christian doctrine of the social obligations obtained for him, at the moment of its production, a certain celebrity in the University of Oxford, and it was understood in clerical and learned circles that young Mr. Rolls had in contemplation a considerable work, a folio, it was said, on the authority of the Fathers of the Church. These attainments, these ambitious designs, however, were far from helping him to any preferment, and he was still in quest of his first curacy when a chance ramble in that part of London, the peaceful and rich aspect of the garden, a desire for solitude and study, and the cheapness of the lodging, led him to take up his abode with Mr. Rayburn, the nurseryman of Stockdove Lane. It was his habit every afternoon, after he had worked 7 or 8 hours on St. Ambrose or St. Chrysostom, to walk for a while in meditation among the roses. And this was usually one of the most productive moments of his day. But even a sincere appetite for thought, and the excitement of grave problems awaiting solution, are not always sufficient to preserve the mind of the philosopher against the petty shocks and contacts of the world. and when Mr. Rolls found General Vandeleur's secretary, ragged and bleeding, in the company of his landlord, when he saw both change colour and seek to avoid his questions, and above all, when the former denied his own identity with the most unmoved assurance, he speedily forgot the saints and fathers in the vulgar interest of curiosity. "I cannot be mistaken," thought he. "That is Mr. Hartley beyond a doubt. How comes he in such a pickle? Why does he deny his name? And what can be his business with that black-looking ruffian, my landlord?" As he was thus reflecting, another peculiar circumstance attracted his attention. The face of Mr. Raeburn appeared at a low window next the door, and as chance directed, his eyes met those of Mr. Rolls. The nurseryman seemed disconcerted and even alarmed, and immediately after the blind of the apartment was pulled sharply down. "This may all be very well," reflected Mr. Rolls. "It may be all excellently well, but I confess freely that I do not think so. Suspicious, underhand, untruthful, fearful of observation, I believe upon my soul," he thought, "the pair are plotting some disgraceful action." The detective that there is in all of us awoke and became clamant in the bosom of Mr. Rolls, and with a brisk, eager step that bore no resemblance to his usual gait, he proceeded to make the circuit of the garden. When he came to the scene of Harry's escalade, his eye was at once arrested by a broken rosebush and marks of trampling on the mould. He looked up and saw scratches on the brick and a rag of trouser floating from a broken bottle. This then was the mode of entrance chosen by Mr. Raeburn's particular friend. It was thus that General Vandeleur's secretary came to admire a flower garden. The young clergyman whistled softly to himself as he stooped to examine the ground. He could make out where Harry had landed from his perilous leap. He recognized the flat foot of Mr. Raeburn, where it had sunk deeply in the soil as he pulled up the secretary by the collar. Nay, on a closer inspection, he seemed to distinguish the marks of groping fingers, as though something had been spilt abroad and eagerly collected. "Upon my word," he thought, "the thing grows vastly interesting." And just then he caught sight of something almost entirely buried in the earth. In an instant, he had disinterred a dainty morocco case, ornamented and clasped in gilt. It had been trodden heavily underfoot, and thus escaped the hurried search of Mr. Raeburn. Mr. Rolls opened the case and drew a long breath of almost horrified astonishment, for there lay before him, in a cradle of green velvet, a diamond of prodigious magnitude and of the finest water. It was of the bigness of a duck's egg, beautifully shaped and without a flaw, and as the sun shone upon it, it gave forth a lustre like that of electricity, and seemed to burn in his hand with 1,000 internal fires. He knew little of precious stones, but the Rajah's diamond was a wonder that explained itself. A village child, if he found it, would run screaming for the nearest cottage, and a savage would prostrate himself in adoration before so imposing a fetish. The beauty of the stone flattered the young clergyman's eyes. The thought of its incalculable value overpowered his intellect. He knew that what he held in his hand was worth more than many years' purchase of an archiepiscopal see, that it would build cathedrals more stately than Ely or Cologne, that he who possessed it was set free forever from the primal curse, and might follow his own inclinations without concern or hurry, without let or hindrance. And as he suddenly turned it, the rays leaped forth again with renewed brilliancy and seemed to pierce his very heart. Decisive actions are often taken in a moment, and without any conscious deliverance from the rational parts of man. So it was now with Mr. Rolls. He glanced hurriedly round, beheld, like Mr. Raeburn before him, nothing but the sunlit flower garden, the tall treetops, and the house with blinded windows, and in a trice he had shut the case, thrust it into his pocket, and was hastening to his study with the speed of guilt. The Reverend Simon Rolls had stolen the Rajah's diamond. Early in the afternoon the police arrived with Harry Hartley. The nurseryman, who was beside himself with terror, readily discovered his hoard, and the jewels were identified and inventoried in the presence of the secretary. As for Mr. Rolls, he showed himself in a most obliging temper, communicated what he knew with freedom, and professed regret that he could do no more to help the officers in their duty. "Still," he added, "I suppose your business is nearly at an end?" "By no means," replied the man from Scotland Yard, and he narrated the second robbery of which Harry had been the immediate victim, and gave the young clergyman a description of the more important jewels that were still not found, dilating particularly on the Rajah's diamond. "It must be worth a fortune," observed Mr. Rolls. 10 fortunes, 20 fortunes," cried the officer. "The more it is worth," remarked Simon shrewdly, "the more difficult it must be to sell. Such a thing has a physiognomy not to be disguised, and I should fancy a man might as easily negotiate St. Paul's Cathedral." "Oh, truly," said the officer, "but if the thief be a man of any intelligence, he will cut it into 3 or 4, and there will be still enough to make him rich." "Thank you," said the clergyman. "You cannot imagine how much your conversation interests me." Whereupon the functionary admitted that they knew many strange things in his profession, and immediately after took his leave. Mr. Rolls regained his apartment. It seemed smaller and barer than usual. The materials for his great work had never presented so little interest, and he looked upon his library with the eye of scorn. He took down, volume by volume, several fathers of the church and glanced them through, but they contained nothing to his purpose. "These old gentlemen," thought he, "are no doubt very valuable writers, but they seem to me conspicuously ignorant of life. Here am I, with learning enough to be a bishop, and I positively do not know how to dispose of a stolen diamond. I glean a hint from a common policeman, and with all my folios, I cannot so much as put it into execution. This inspires me with very low ideas of university training." Herewith he kicked over his bookshelf, and putting on his hat, hastened from the house to the club of which he was a member. In such a place of mundane resort he hoped to find some man of good counsel and a shrewd experience in life. In the reading room he saw many of the country clergy and an archdeacon. There were 3 journalists and a writer upon the higher metaphysic, playing pool, and at dinner only the raff of ordinary club frequenters showed their commonplace and obliterated countenances. None of these, thought Mr. Rolls, would know more on dangerous topics than he knew himself. None of them were fit to give him guidance in his present strait. At length, in the smoking room, up many weary stairs, he hit upon a gentleman of somewhat portly build and dressed with conspicuous plainness. He was smoking a cigar and reading the Fortnightly Review. His face was singularly free from all sign of preoccupation or fatigue, and there was something in his air which seemed to invite confidence and to expect submission. The more the young clergyman scrutinized his features, the more he was convinced that he had fallen on one capable of giving pertinent advice. "Sir," said he, "you will excuse my abruptness, but I judge you from your appearance to be preeminently a man of the world." "I have indeed considerable claims to that distinction," replied the stranger, laying aside his magazine with a look of mingled amusement and surprise. "I, sir," continued the curate, "am a recluse, a student, a creature of ink bottles and patristic folios. A recent event has brought my folly vividly before my eyes, and I desire to instruct myself in life. By life," he added, "I do not mean Thackeray's novels, but the crimes and secret possibilities of our society, and the principles of wise conduct among exceptional events. I am a patient reader. Can the thing be learnt in books?" "You put me in a difficulty," said the stranger. "I confess I have no great notion of the use of books except to amuse a railway journey, although I believe there are some very exact treatises on astronomy, the use of the globes, agriculture, and the art of making paper flowers. Upon the less apparent provinces of life, I fear you will find nothing truthful. Yet stay," he added, "have you read Gaboriau?" Mr. Rolls admitted he had never even heard the name. "You may gather some notions from Gaboriau," resumed the stranger. "He is at least suggestive, and as he is an author much studied by Prince Bismarck, you will at the worst lose your time in good society." "Sir," said the curate, "I am infinitely obliged by your politeness." "You have already more than repaid me," returned the other. "How?" inquired Simon. "By the novelty of your request," replied the gentleman, and with a polite gesture as though to ask permission, he resumed the study of the Fortnightly Review. On his way home, Mr. Rolls purchased a work on precious stones and several of Gaboriau's novels. These last he eagerly skimmed until an advanced hour in the morning. But although they introduced him to many new ideas, he could nowhere discover what to do with a stolen diamond. He was annoyed, moreover, to find the information scattered amongst romantic storytelling, instead of soberly set forth after the manner of a manual. And he concluded that, even if the writer had thought much upon these subjects, he was totally lacking in educational method. For the character and attainments of Lecoq, however, he was unable to contain his admiration. He was truly a great creature, ruminated Mr. Rolls. He knew the world as I know Paley's evidences. There was nothing that he could not carry to a termination with his own hand, and against the largest odds. Heavens, he broke out suddenly, is not this the lesson? Must I not learn to cut diamonds for myself? It seemed to him as if he had sailed at once out of his perplexities. He remembered that he knew a jeweller, one B. McCulloch, in Edinburgh, who would be glad to put him in the way of the necessary training. A few months, perhaps a few years, of sordid toil, and he would be sufficiently expert to divide and sufficiently cunning to dispose with advantage of the Rajah's diamond. That done, he might return to pursue his researches at leisure, a wealthy and luxurious student, envied and respected by all. Golden visions attended him through his slumber, and he awoke refreshed and light-hearted with the morning sun. Mr. Rayburn's house was on that day to be closed by the police, and this afforded a pretext for his departure. He cheerfully prepared his baggage, transported it to King's Cross, where he left it in the cloakroom, and returned to the club to while away the afternoon and dine. "If you dine here today, Rolls," observed an acquaintance, "you may see two of the most remarkable men in England, Prince Florizel of Bohemia and old Jack Vandeleur." "I have heard of the prince," replied Mr. Rolls, "and General Vandeleur I have even met in society." "General Vandeleur is an ass," returned the other. "This is his brother John, the biggest adventurer, the best judge of precious stones, and one of the most acute diplomatists in Europe. Have you never heard of his duel with the Duke de Valdorge? Of his exploits and atrocities when he was dictator of Paraguay? Of his dexterity in recovering Sir Samuel Levy's jewellery? Nor of his services in the Indian Mutiny? Services by which the government profited, but which the government dared not recognise. You make me wonder what we mean by fame, or even by infamy, for Jack Vandeleur has prodigious claims to both. Run downstairs," he continued, "take a table near them and keep your ears open. You will hear some strange talk, or I am much misled." "But how shall I know them?" inquired the clergyman. "Know them!" cried his friend. "Why, the prince is the finest gentleman in Europe, the only living creature who looks like a king. And as for Jack Vandeleur, if you can imagine Ulysses at 70 years of age and with a sabre cut across his face, you have the man before you. Know them indeed. Why, you could pick either of them out of a Derby day." Rolls eagerly hurried to the dining room. It was as his friend had asserted. It was impossible to mistake the pair in question. Old John Vandeleur was of a remarkable force of body, and obviously broken to the most difficult exercises. He had neither the carriage of a swordsman, nor of a sailor, nor yet of one much inured to the saddle. But something made up of all these, and the result and expression of many different habits and dexterities. His features were bold and aquiline, his expression arrogant and predatory, his whole appearance that of a swift, violent, unscrupulous man of action, and his copious white hair and the deep sabre cut that traversed his nose and temple added a note of savagery to a head already remarkable and menacing in itself. In his companion, the Prince of Bohemia, Mr. Rolls was astonished to recognize the gentleman who had recommended him the study of Gaboriau. Doubtless Prince Florizel, who rarely visited the club, of which, as of most others, he was an honorary member, had been waiting for John Vandeleur when Simon accosted him on the previous evening. The other diners had modestly retired into the angles of the room, and left the distinguished pair in a certain isolation. But the young clergyman was unrestrained by any sentiment of awe, and marching boldly up, took his place at the nearest table. The conversation was, indeed, new to the student's ears. The ex-dictator of Paraguay stated many extraordinary experiences in different quarters of the world, and the prince supplied a commentary which, to a man of thought, was even more interesting than the events themselves. Two forms of experience were thus brought together and laid before the young clergyman, and he did not know which to admire the most, the desperate actor or the skilled expert in life, the man who spoke boldly of his own deeds and perils, or the man who seemed like a god to know all things and to have suffered nothing. The manner of each aptly fitted with his part in the discourse. The dictator indulged in brutalities alike of speech and gesture. His hand opened and shut and fell roughly on the table, and his voice was loud and heavy. The prince, on the other hand, seemed the very type of urbane docility and quiet. The least movement, the least inflection, had with him a weightier significance than all the shouts and pantomime of his companion. And if ever, as must frequently have been the case, he described some experience personal to himself, it was so aptly dissimulated as to pass unnoticed with the rest. At length the talk wandered on to the late robberies and the Rajah's diamond. "That diamond would be better in the sea," observed Prince Florizel. "As a Vandeleur," replied the dictator, "your highness may imagine my dissent." "I speak on grounds of public policy," pursued the prince. "Jewels so valuable should be reserved for the collection of a prince or the treasury of a great nation. To hand them about among the common sort of men is to set a price on virtue's head. And if the Rajah of Kashgar, a prince, I understand, of great enlightenment, desired vengeance upon the men of Europe, he could hardly have gone more efficaciously about his purpose than by sending us this apple of discord. There is no honesty too robust for such a trial. I myself, who have many duties and many privileges of my own, I myself, Mr. Vandeleur, could scarce handle the intoxicating crystal and be safe. As for you, who are a diamond hunter by taste and profession, I do not believe there is a crime in the calendar you would not perpetrate. I do not believe you have a friend in the world whom you would not eagerly betray. I do not know if you have a family, but if you have, I declare you would sacrifice your children. And all this for what? Not to be richer, nor to have more comforts or more respect, but simply to call this diamond yours for a year or two until you die, and now and again to open a safe and look at it as one looks at a picture." "It is true," replied Vandeleur. "I have hunted most things, from men and women down to mosquitoes. I have dived for coral. I have followed both whales and tigers, and a diamond is the tallest quarry of the lot. It has beauty and worth. It alone can properly reward the ardours of the chase. At this moment, as your highness may fancy, I am upon the trail. I have a sure knack, a wide experience. I know every stone of price in my brother's collection as a shepherd knows his sheep, and I wish I may die if I do not recover them every one." "Sir Thomas Vandeleur will have great cause to thank you," said the prince. "I am not so sure," returned the dictator with a laugh. "One of the Vandeleurs will. Thomas or John, Peter or Paul, we are all apostles." "I did not catch your observation," said the prince with some disgust, and at the same moment the waiter informed Mr. Vandeleur that his cab was at the door. Mr. Rolls glanced at the clock and saw that he also must be moving, and the coincidence struck him sharply and unpleasantly, for he desired to see no more of the diamond hunter. Much study having somewhat shaken the young man's nerves, he was in the habit of travelling in the most luxurious manner, and for the present journey he had taken a sofa in the sleeping carriage. "You will be very comfortable," said the guard. "There is no one in your compartment, and only one old gentleman in the other end." It was close upon the hour, and the tickets were being examined, when Mr. Rolls beheld this other fellow passenger ushered by several porters into his place. Certainly, there was not another man in the world whom he would not have preferred, for it was old John Vandeleur, the ex-dictator. The sleeping carriages on the Great Northern Line were divided into 3 compartments, one at each end for travellers, and one in the centre fitted with the conveniences of a lavatory. A door running in grooves separated each of the others from the lavatory, but as there were neither bolts nor locks, the whole suite was practically common ground. When Mr. Rolls had studied his position, he perceived himself without defence. If the dictator chose to pay him a visit in the course of the night, he could do no less than receive it. He had no means of fortification, and lay open to attack as if he had been lying in the fields. This situation caused him some agony of mind. He recalled with alarm the boastful statements of his fellow traveller across the dining table, and the professions of immorality which he had heard him offering to the disgusted prince. Some persons, he remembered to have read, are endowed with a singular quickness of perception for the neighbourhood of precious metals. Through walls, and even at considerable distances, they are said to divine the presence of gold. Might it not be the same with diamonds? He wondered. And if so, who was more likely to enjoy this transcendental sense than the person who gloried in the appellation of the diamond hunter? From such a man he recognized that he had everything to fear, and longed eagerly for the arrival of the day. In the meantime he neglected no precaution, concealed his diamond in the most internal pocket of a system of great coats, and devoutly recommended himself to the care of Providence. The train pursued its usual even and rapid course, and nearly half the journey had been accomplished before slumber began to triumph over uneasiness in the breast of Mr. Rolls. For some time he resisted its influence, but it grew upon him more and more, and a little before York he was fain to stretch himself upon one of the couches and suffer his eyes to close. And almost at the same instant consciousness deserted the young clergyman. His last thought was of his terrifying neighbour. When he awoke it was still pitch dark, except for the flicker of the veiled lamp, and the continual roaring and oscillation testified to the unrelaxed velocity of the train. He sat upright in a panic, for he had been tormented by the most uneasy dreams. It was some seconds before he recovered his self-command, and even after he had resumed a recumbent attitude, sleep continued to flee him, and he lay awake with his brain in a state of violent agitation and his eyes fixed upon the lavatory door. He pulled his clerical felt hat over his brow still farther to shield him from the light, and he adopted the usual expedients, such as counting 1,000 or banishing thought, by which experienced invalids are accustomed to woo the approach of sleep. In the case of Mr. Rolls, they proved one and all vain. He was harassed by a dozen different anxieties. The old man in the other end of the carriage haunted him in the most alarming shapes, and in whatever attitude he chose to lie, the diamond in his pocket occasioned him a sensible physical distress. It burned, it was too large, it bruised his ribs, and there were infinitesimal fractions of a second in which he had half a mind to throw it from the window. While he was thus lying, a strange incident took place. The sliding door into the lavatory stirred a little, and then a little more, and was finally drawn back for the space of about 20 inches. The lamp in the lavatory was unshaded, and in the lighted aperture thus disclosed, Mr. Rolls could see the head of Mr. Vandeleur in an attitude of deep attention. He was conscious that the gaze of the dictator rested intently on his own face, and the instinct of self-preservation moved him to hold his breath, to refrain from the least movement, and keeping his eyes lowered, to watch his visitor from underneath the lashes. After about a moment, the head was withdrawn and the door of the lavatory replaced. The dictator had not come to attack, but to observe. His action was not that of a man threatening another, but that of a man who was himself threatened. If Mr. Rolls was afraid of him, it appeared that he, in his turn, was not quite easy on the score of Mr. Rolls. He had come, it would seem, to make sure that his only fellow traveller was asleep, and when satisfied on that point, he had at once withdrawn. The clergyman leapt to his feet. The extreme of terror had given place to a reaction of foolhardy daring. He reflected that the rattle of the flying train concealed all other sounds, and determined, come what might, to return the visit he had just received. Divesting himself of his cloak, which might have interfered with the freedom of his action, he entered the lavatory and paused to listen. As he had expected, there was nothing to be heard above the roar of the train's progress, and laying his hand on the door at the farther side, he proceeded cautiously to draw it back for about 6 inches. Then he stopped, and could not contain an ejaculation of surprise. John Vandeleur wore a fur travelling cap with lappets to protect his ears, and this may have combined with the sound of the express to keep him in ignorance of what was going forward. It is certain, at least, that he did not raise his head, but continued without interruption to pursue his strange employment. Between his feet stood an open hat-box. In one hand he held the sleeve of his sealskin greatcoat, in the other a formidable knife, with which he had just slit up the lining of the sleeve. Mr. Rolls had read of persons carrying money in a belt, and as he had no acquaintance with any but cricket belts, he had never been able rightly to conceive how this was managed. But here was a stranger thing before his eyes, for John Vandeleur, it appeared, carried diamonds in the lining of his sleeve, and even as the young clergyman gazed, he could see one glittering, brilliant drop after another into the hat-box. He stood riveted to the spot, following this unusual business with his eyes. The diamonds were, for the most part, small, and not easily distinguishable either in shape or fire. Suddenly the dictator appeared to find a difficulty. He employed both hands and stooped over his task, but it was not until after considerable manoeuvring that he extricated a large tiara of diamonds from the lining and held it up for some seconds' examination before he placed it with the others in the hat-box. The tiara was a ray of light to Mr. Rolls. He immediately recognized it for a part of the treasure stolen from Harry Hartley by the loiterer. There was no room for mistake. It was exactly as the detective had described it. There were the ruby stars, with a great emerald in the center. There were the interlacing crescents, and there were the pear-shaped pendants, each a single stone, which gave a special value to Lady Vandeleur's tiara. Mr. Rolls was hugely relieved. The dictator was as deeply in the affair as he was. Neither could tell tales upon the other. In the first glow of happiness, the clergyman suffered a deep sigh to escape him, and as his bosom had become choked and his throat dry during his previous suspense, the sigh was followed by a cough. Mr. Vandeleur looked up, his face contracted with the blackest and most deadly passion. His eyes opened widely, and his underjaw dropped in an astonishment that was upon the brink of fury. By an instinctive movement, he had covered the hat box with the coat. For half a minute the two men stared upon each other in silence. It was not a long interval, but it sufficed for Mr. Rolls. He was one of those who think swiftly on dangerous occasions. He decided on a course of action of a singularly daring nature, and although he felt he was setting his life upon the hazard, he was the first to break silence. "I beg your pardon," said he. The dictator shivered slightly, and when he spoke his voice was hoarse. "What do you want here?" he asked. "I take a particular interest in diamonds," replied Mr. Rolls with an air of perfect self-possession. "Two connoisseurs should be acquainted. I have here a trifle of my own which may perhaps serve for an introduction." And so saying, he quietly took the case from his pocket, showed the Rajah's diamond to the dictator for an instant, and replaced it in security. "It was once your brother's," he added. John Vandeleur continued to regard him with a look of almost painful amazement, but he neither spoke nor moved. "I was pleased to observe," resumed the young man, "that we have gems from the same collection." The dictator's surprise overpowered him. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I begin to perceive that I am growing old. I am positively not prepared for little incidents like this, but set my mind at rest upon one point. Do my eyes deceive me, or are you indeed a parson?" "I am in holy orders," answered Mr. Rolls. "Well," cried the other, "as long as I live I will never hear another word against the cloth." "You flatter me," said Mr. Rolls. "Pardon me," replied Vandeleur. "Pardon me, young man. You are no coward, but it still remains to be seen whether you are not the worst of fools. Perhaps," he continued, leaning back upon his seat, "perhaps you would oblige me with a few particulars. I must suppose you had some object in the stupefying impudence of your proceedings, and I confess I have a curiosity to know it." "It is very simple," replied the clergyman. "It proceeds from my great inexperience of life." "I shall be glad to be persuaded," answered Vandeleur, whereupon Mr. Rolls told him the whole story of his connection with the Rajah's diamond, from the time he found it in Raeburn's garden to the time when he left London in the Flying Scotchman. He added a brief sketch of his feelings and thoughts during the journey, and concluded in these words. "When I recognized the tiara, I knew we were in the same attitude towards society, and this inspired me with a hope, which I trust you will say was not ill-founded, that you might become in some sense my partner in the difficulties and, of course, the profits of my situation. To one of your special knowledge and obviously great experience, the negotiation of the diamond would give but little trouble, while to me it was a matter of impossibility. On the other part, I judged that I might lose nearly as much by cutting the diamond, and that not improbably with an unskillful hand, as might enable me to pay you with proper generosity for your assistance. The subject was a delicate one to broach, and perhaps I fell short in delicacy. But I must ask you to remember that for me the situation was a new one, and I was entirely unacquainted with the etiquette in use. I believe without vanity that I could have married or baptized you in a very acceptable manner. But every man has his own aptitudes, and this sort of bargain was not among the list of my accomplishments. "I do not wish to flatter you," replied Vandeleur, "but upon my word, you have an unusual disposition for a life of crime. You have more accomplishments than you imagine, and though I have encountered a number of rogues in different quarters of the world, I never met with one so unblushing as yourself. Cheer up, Mr. Rolls. You are in the right profession at last. As for helping you, you may command me as you will. I have only a day's business in Edinburgh on a little matter for my brother, and once that is concluded, I return to Paris, where I usually reside. If you please, you may accompany me thither. And before the end of a month, I believe I shall have brought your little business to a satisfactory conclusion." At this point, contrary to all the canons of his art, our Arabian author breaks off the story of the young man in holy orders, I regret and condemn such practices, but I must follow my original and refer the reader for the conclusion of Mr. Rolle's adventures to the next number of the cycle, The Story of the House with the Green Blinds. Story of the House with the Green Blinds. Francis Scrimgeour, a clerk in the Bank of Scotland at Edinburgh, had attained the age of 25 in a sphere of quiet, creditable and domestic life. His mother died while he was young, but his father, a man of sense and probity, had given him an excellent education at school and brought him up at home to orderly and frugal habits. Francis, who was of a docile and affectionate disposition, profited by these advantages with zeal, and devoted himself heart and soul to his employment. A walk upon Saturday afternoon, an occasional dinner with members of his family, and a yearly tour of a fortnight in the Highlands, or even on the continent of Europe, were his principal distractions, and he grew rapidly in favour with his superiors, and enjoyed already a salary of nearly £200 a year, with the prospect of an ultimate advance to almost double that amount. Few young men were more contented, few more willing and laborious than Francis Scrimgeour. Sometimes at night, when he had read the daily paper, he would play upon the flute to amuse his father, for whose qualities he entertained a great respect. One day he received a note from a well-known firm of writers to the Signet, requesting the favour of an immediate interview with him. The letter was marked private and confidential, and had been addressed to him at the bank instead of at home, two unusual circumstances which made him obey the summons with the more alacrity. The senior member of the firm, a man of much austerity of manner, made him gravely welcome, requested him to take a seat, and proceeded to explain the matter in hand, in the picked expressions of a veteran man of business. A person who must remain nameless, but of whom the lawyer had every reason to think well, a man, in short, of some station in the country, desired to make Francis an annual allowance of £500. The capital was to be placed under the control of the lawyer's firm and two trustees who must also remain anonymous. There were conditions annexed to this liberality, but he was of opinion that his new client would find nothing either excessive or dishonourable in the terms, and he repeated these two words with emphasis, as though he desired to commit himself to nothing more. Francis asked their nature. "The conditions," said the writer to the Signet, "are, as I have twice remarked, neither dishonourable nor excessive. At the same time, I cannot conceal from you that they are most unusual. Indeed, the whole case is very much out of our way, and I should certainly have refused it had it not been for the reputation of the gentleman who entrusted it to my care. And let me add, Mr. Scrimgeour, the interest I have been led to take in yourself by many complimentary and, I have no doubt, well-deserved reports." Francis entreated him to be more specific. "You cannot picture my uneasiness as to these conditions," he said. "They are two," replied the lawyer, "only two, and the sum, as you will remember, is £500 a year, and unburdened, I forgot to add, unburdened." And the lawyer raised his eyebrows at him with solemn gusto. "The first," he resumed, "is of remarkable simplicity. You must be in Paris by the afternoon of Sunday, the 15th. There you will find, at the box office of the Comédie Française, a ticket for admission taken in your name and waiting you. You are requested to sit out the whole performance in the seat provided, and that is all." "I should certainly have preferred a weekday," replied Francis. "But after all, once in a way. And in Paris, my dear sir," added the lawyer soothingly. "I believe I am something of a precisian myself, but upon such a consideration, and in Paris, I should not hesitate an instant." And the pair laughed pleasantly together. "The other is of more importance," continued the writer to the Signet. "It regards your marriage. My client, taking a deep interest in your welfare, desires to advise you absolutely in the choice of a wife. Absolutely, you understand," he repeated. "Let us be more explicit, if you please," returned Francis. "Am I to marry anyone, maid or widow, black or white, whom this invisible person chooses to propose?" "I was to assure you that suitability of age and position should be a principle with your benefactor," replied the lawyer. "As to race, I confess the difficulty had not occurred to me and I failed to inquire, but if you like I will make a note of it at once and advise you on the earliest opportunity." "Sir," said Francis, "it remains to be seen whether this whole affair is not a most unworthy fraud. The circumstances are inexplicable, I had almost said incredible, and until I see a little more daylight and some plausible motive, I confess I should be very sorry to put a hand to the transaction. I appeal to you in this difficulty for information. I must learn what is at the bottom of it all. If you do not know, cannot guess, or are not at liberty to tell me, I shall take my hat and go back to my bank as came." "I do not know," answered the lawyer, "but I have an excellent guess. Your father, and no one else, is at the root of this apparently unnatural business." "My father!" cried Francis in extreme disdain. "Worthy man, I know every thought of his mind, every penny of his fortune." "You misinterpret my words," said the lawyer. "I do not refer to Mr. Scrimger, Senior, for he is not your father. When he and his wife came to Edinburgh, you were already nearly 1 year old, and you had not yet been 3 months in their care. The secret has been well kept, but such is the fact. Your father is unknown, and I say again that I believe him to be the original of the offers I am charged at present to transmit to you." It would be impossible to exaggerate the astonishment of Francis Scrimger at this unexpected information. He pled this confusion to the lawyer. "Sir," said he, "after a piece of news so startling, you must grant me some hours for thought. You shall know this evening what conclusion I have reached." The lawyer commended his prudence, and Francis, excusing himself upon some pretext at the bank, took a long walk into the country, and fully considered the different steps and aspects of the case. A pleasant sense of his own importance rendered him the more deliberate, but the issue was from the first not doubtful. His whole carnal man leaned irresistibly towards the 500 a year, and the strange conditions with which it was burdened. He discovered in his heart an invincible repugnance to the name of Scrimger, which he had never hitherto disliked. He began to despise the narrow and unromantic interests of his former life, and when once his mind was fairly made up, he walked with a new feeling of strength and freedom, and nourished himself with the gayest anticipations. He said but a word to the lawyer, and immediately received a cheque for 2 quarters arrears, for the allowance was antedated from the 1st of January. With this in his pocket, he walked home. The flat in Scotland Street looked mean in his eyes. His nostrils for the first time rebelled against the odour of broth, and he observed little defects of manner in his adoptive father which filled him with surprise and almost with disgust. The next day, he determined, should see him on his way to Paris. In that city, where he arrived long before the appointed date, he put up at a modest hotel frequented by English and Italians, and devoted himself to improvement in the French tongue. For this purpose he had a master twice a week, entered into conversation with loiterers in the Champs-Élysées, and nightly frequented the theatre. He had his whole toilette fashionably renewed, and was shaved and had his hair dressed every morning by a barber in a neighbouring street. This gave him something of a foreign air, and seemed to wipe off the reproach of his past years. At length, on the Saturday afternoon, he betook himself to the box office of the theatre in the Rue Richelieu. No sooner had he mentioned his name than the clerk produced the order in an envelope of which the address was scarcely dry. "It has been taken this moment," said the clerk. "Indeed," said Francis. "May I ask what the gentleman was like?" "Your friend is easy to describe," replied the official. "He is old and strong and beautiful, with white hair and a sabre cut across his face. You cannot fail to recognize so marked a person." "No, indeed," returned Francis, "and I thank you for your politeness." "He cannot yet be far distant," added the clerk. "If you make haste, you might still overtake him." Francis did not wait to be twice told. He ran precipitately from the theatre into the middle of the street, and looked in all directions. More than one white-haired man was within sight, but though he overtook each of them in succession, all wanted the sabre cut. For nearly half an hour he tried one street after another in the neighbourhood, until at length, recognizing the folly of continued search, he started on a walk to compose his agitated feelings. For this proximity of an encounter with him to whom he could not doubt he owed the day had profoundly moved the young man. It chanced that his way lay up the Rue Drouot, and thence up the Rue des Martyrs, and chance, in this case, served him better than all the forethought in the world. For on the outer boulevard he saw 2 men in earnest colloquy upon a seat. One was dark, young and handsome, secularly dressed, but with an indelible clerical stamp. The other answered in every particular to the description given him by the clerk. Francis felt his heart beat high in his bosom. He knew he was now about to hear the voice of his father, and making a wide circuit, he noiselessly took his place behind the couple in question, who were too much interested in their talk to observe much else. As Francis had expected, the conversation was conducted in the English language. "Your suspicions begin to annoy me, Roll," said the older man. "I tell you I am doing my utmost. A man cannot lay his hand on millions in a moment. Have I not taken you up, a mere stranger, out of pure goodwill? Are you not living largely on my bounty?" "On your advances, Mr. Vandeleur," corrected the other. "Advances, if you choose, and interest instead of goodwill, if you prefer it," returned Vandeleur angrily. "I am not here to pick expressions. Business is business, and your business, let me remind you, is too muddy for such airs. Trust me or leave me alone and find someone else. But let us have an end, for God's sake, of your Jeremiads." "I am beginning to learn the world," replied the other, "and I see that you have every reason to play me false and not one to deal honestly. I am not here to pick expressions either. You wish the diamond for yourself. You know you do. You dare not deny it. Have you not already forged my name and searched my lodging in my absence? I understand the cause of your delays. You are lying in wait. You are the diamond hunter, forsooth, and sooner or later, by fair means or foul, you'll lay your hands upon it. I tell you it must stop. Push me much further and I promise you a surprise." "It does not become you to use threats," returned Vandeleur. "Two can play at that. My brother is here in Paris. The police are on the alert. And if you persist in wearying me with your caterwauling, I will arrange a little astonishment for you, Mr. Rolls. But mine shall be once and for all. Do you understand, or would you prefer me to tell it you in Hebrew? There is an end to all things, and you have come to the end of my patience. Tuesday at 7. Not a day, not an hour sooner, not the least part of a second, if it were to save your life. And if you do not choose to wait, you may go to the bottomless pit for me. And welcome." And so saying, the dictator arose from the bench and marched off in the direction of Montmartre, shaking his head and swinging his cane with a most furious air, while his companion remained where he was, in an attitude of great dejection. Francis was at the pitch of surprise and horror. His sentiments had been shocked to the last degree. The hopeful tenderness with which he had taken his place upon the bench was transformed into repulsion and despair. Old Mr. Scrimgeour, he reflected, was a far more kindly and creditable parent than this dangerous and violent intriguer. But he retained his presence of mind, and suffered not a moment to elapse before he was on the trail of the dictator. That gentleman's fury carried him forward at a brisk pace, and he was so completely occupied in his angry thoughts that he never so much as cast a look behind him till he reached his own door. His house stood high up in the Rue Lepic, commanding a view of all Paris and enjoying the pure air of the heights. It was 2 stories high, with green blinds and shutters, and all the windows looking on the street were hermetically closed. Tops of trees showed over the high garden wall, and the wall was protected by chevaux de frise. The dictator paused a moment while he searched his pocket for a key, and then, opening a gate, disappeared within the enclosure. Francis looked about him. The neighborhood was very lonely, the house isolated in its garden. It seemed as if his observation must here come to an abrupt end. A second glance, however, showed him a tall house next door presenting a gable to the garden, and in this gable a single window. He passed to the front and saw a ticket offering unfurnished lodgings by the month, and on inquiry, the room which commanded the dictator's garden proved to be one of those to let. Francis did not hesitate a moment. He took the room, paid an advance upon the rent, and returned to his hotel to seek his baggage. The old man with the sabre cut might or might not be his father. He might or he might not be upon the true scent. But he was certainly on the edge of an exciting mystery, and he promised himself that he would not relax his observation until he had got to the bottom of the secret. From the window of his new apartment, Francis Scrimgeour commanded a complete view into the garden of the house with the green blinds. Immediately below him, a very comely chestnut with wide boughs sheltered a pair of rustic tables where people might dine in the height of summer. On all sides, save one, a dense vegetation concealed the soil. But there, between the tables and the house, he saw a patch of gravel walk leading from the veranda to the garden gate. Studying the place from between the boards of the Venetian shutters, which he durst not open for fear of attracting attention, Francis observed but little to indicate the manners of the inhabitants, and that little argued no more than a close reserve and a taste for solitude. The garden was conventual. The house had the air of a prison. The green blinds were all drawn down upon the outside. The door into the veranda was closed. The garden, as far as he could see it, was left entirely to itself in the evening sunshine. A modest curl of smoke from a single chimney alone testified to the presence of living people. In order that he might not be entirely idle, and to give a certain colour to his way of life, Francis had purchased Euclid's Geometry in French, which he set himself to copy and translate on the top of his portmanteau and seated on the floor against the wall, for he was equally without chair or table. From time to time he would rise and cast a glance into the enclosure of the house with the green blinds, but the windows remained obstinately closed and the garden empty. Only late in the evening did anything occur to reward his continued attention. Between 9 and 10, the sharp tinkle of a bell aroused him from a fit of dozing, and he sprang to his observatory in time to hear an important noise of locks being opened and bars removed, and to see Mr. Vandeleur, carrying a lantern and clothed in a flowing robe of black velvet with a skull-cap to match, issue from under the veranda and proceed leisurely towards the garden gate. The sound of bolts and bars was then repeated, and a moment after Francis perceived the dictator escorting into the house, in the mobile light of the lantern, an individual of the lowest and most despicable appearance. Half an hour afterwards the visitor was reconducted to the street, and Mr. Vandeleur, setting his light upon one of the rustic tables, finished a cigar with great deliberation under the foliage of the chestnut. Francis, peering through a clear space among the leaves, was able to follow his gestures as he threw away the ash or enjoyed a copious inhalation, and beheld a cloud upon the old man's brow and a forcible action of the lips, which testified to some deep and probably painful train of thought. The cigar was already almost at an end, when the voice of a young girl was heard suddenly crying the hour from the interior of the house. "In a moment," replied John Vandeleur, and with that he threw away the stump, and taking up the lantern, sailed away under the veranda for the night. As soon as the door was closed, absolute darkness fell upon the house. Francis might try his eyesight as much as he pleased. He could not detect so much as a single chink of light below a blind, and he concluded with great good sense that the bedchambers were all upon the other side. Early the next morning, for he was early awake after an uncomfortable night upon the floor, he saw cause to adopt a different explanation. The blinds rose, one after another, by means of a spring in the interior, and disclosed steel shutters such as we see on the front of shops. These in their turn were rolled up by a similar contrivance, and for the space of about an hour, the chambers were left open to the morning air. At the end of that time Mr. Vandeleur, with his own hand, once more closed the shutters and replaced the blinds from within. While Francis was still marvelling at these precautions, the door opened and a young girl came forth to look about her in the garden. It was not 2 minutes before she re-entered the house, but even in that short time he saw enough to convince him that she possessed the most unusual attractions. His curiosity was not only highly excited by this incident, but his spirits were improved to a still more notable degree. The alarming manners and more than equivocal life of his father ceased from that moment to prey upon his mind. From that moment he embraced his new family with ardour, and whether the young lady should prove his sister or his wife, he felt convinced she was an angel in disguise. So much was this the case that he was seized with a sudden horror when he reflected how little he really knew, and how possible it was that he had followed the wrong person when he followed Mr. Vandeleur. The porter, whom he consulted, could afford him little information, but, such as it was, it had a mysterious and questionable sound. The person next door was an English gentleman of extraordinary wealth, and proportionately eccentric in his tastes and habits. He possessed great collections, which he kept in the house beside him, and it was to protect these that he had fitted the place with steel shutters, elaborate fastenings, and chevaux de frise along the garden wall. He lived much alone in spite of some strange visitors with whom it seemed he had business to transact, and there was no one else in the house except Mademoiselle and an old woman servant. "Is Mademoiselle his daughter?" inquired Francis. "Certainly," replied the porter. "Mademoiselle is the daughter of the house, and strange it is to see how she is made to work. For all his riches, it is she who goes to market, and every day in the week you may see her going by with a basket on her arm. "And the collections?" asked the other. "Sir," said the man, "they are immensely valuable. More I cannot tell you. Since Monsieur de Vandeleur's arrival, no one in the quarter has so much as passed the door." "Suppose not," returned Francis. "You must surely have some notion what these famous galleries contain. Is it pictures, silks, statues, jewels, or what?" "My faith, sir," said the fellow with a shrug, "it might be carrots, and still I could not tell you. How should I know? The house is kept like a garrison, as you perceive." And then, as Francis was returning disappointed to his room, the porter called him back. "I have just remembered, sir," said he. "Monsieur de Vandeleur has been in all parts of the world, and I once heard the old woman declare that he had brought many diamonds back with him. If that be the truth, there must be a fine show behind those shutters." By an early hour on Sunday, Francis was in his place at the theatre. The seat which had been taken for him was only 2 or 3 numbers from the left-hand side, and directly opposite one of the lower boxes. As the seat had been specially chosen, there was doubtless something to be learned from its position, and he judged by an instinct that the box upon his right was, in some way or other, to be connected with the drama in which he ignorantly played a part. Indeed, it was so situated that its occupants could safely observe him from beginning to end of the piece, if they were so minded, while, profiting by the depth, they could screen themselves sufficiently well from any counter-examination on his side. He promised himself not to leave it for a moment out of sight, and whilst he scanned the rest of the theatre, or made a show of attending to the business of the stage, he always kept a corner of an eye upon the empty box. The second act had been some time in progress, and was even drawing towards a close, when the door opened and 2 persons entered and ensconced themselves in the darkest of the shade. Francis could hardly control his emotion. It was Mr. Vandeleur and his daughter. The blood came and went in his arteries and veins with stunning activity. His ears sang, his head turned. He dared not look lest he should awake suspicion. His playbill, which he kept reading from end to end and over again, turned from white to red before his eyes. And when he cast a glance upon the stage, it seemed incalculably far away, and he found the voices and gestures of the actors to the last degree impertinent and absurd. From time to time he risked a momentary look in the direction which principally interested him, and once at least he felt certain that his eyes encountered those of the young girl. A shock passed over his body, and he saw all the colours of the rainbow. What would he not have given to overhear what passed between the Vandeleurs? What would he not have given for the courage to take up his opera glass and steadily inspect their attitude and expression? There, for aught he knew, his whole life was being decided, and he not able to interfere, not able even to follow the debate, but condemned to sit and suffer where he was, in impotent anxiety. At last, the act came to an end. The curtain fell, and the people around him began to leave their places for the interval. It was only natural that he should follow their example, and if he did so, it was not only natural but necessary that he should pass immediately in front of the box in question. Summoning all his courage, but keeping his eyes lowered, Francis drew near the spot. His progress was slow, for the old gentleman before him moved with incredible deliberation, wheezing as he went. What was he to do? Should he address the Vandeleurs by name as he went by? Should he take the flower from his buttonhole and throw it into the box? Should he raise his face and direct one long and affectionate look upon the lady who was either his sister or his betrothed? As he found himself thus struggling among so many alternatives, he had a vision of his old equable existence in the bank, and was assailed by a thought of regret for the past. By this time he had arrived directly opposite the box, and although he was still undetermined what to do or whether to do anything, he turned his head and lifted his eyes. No sooner had he done so than he uttered a cry of disappointment and remained rooted to the spot. The box was empty. During his slow advance, Mr. Vandeleur and his daughter had quietly slipped away. A polite person in his rear reminded him that he was stopping the path, and he moved on again with mechanical footsteps and suffered the crowd to carry him unresisting out of the theatre. Once in the street, the pressure ceasing, he came to a halt, and the cool night air speedily restored him to the possession of his faculties. He was surprised to find that his head ached violently and that he remembered not one word of the 2 acts which he had witnessed. As the excitement wore away, it was succeeded by an overweening appetite for sleep, and he hailed a cab and drove to his lodging in a state of extreme exhaustion and some disgust of life. Next morning, he lay in wait for Miss Vandeleur on her road to market, and by 8 o'clock beheld her stepping down a lane. She was simply, and even poorly, attired, but in the carriage of her head and body there was something flexible and noble that would have lent distinction to the meanest toilette. Even her basket, so aptly did she carry it, became her like an ornament. It seemed to Francis, as he slipped into a doorway, that the sunshine followed and the shadows fled before her as she walked, and he was conscious, for the first time, of a bird singing in a cage above the lane. He suffered her to pass the doorway, and then, coming forth once more, addressed her by name from behind. "Miss Vandeleur," said he. She turned, and when she saw who he was, became deadly pale. "Pardon me," he continued. "Heaven knows I had no will to startle you. And indeed, there should be nothing startling in the presence of one who wishes you so well as I do. And believe me, I am acting rather from necessity than choice. We have many things in common, and I am sadly in the dark. There is much that I should be doing, and my hands are tied. I do not know even what to feel, nor who are my friends and enemies." She found her voice with an effort. "I do not know who you are," she said. "Ah, yes, Miss Vandeleur, you do," returned Francis, "better than I do myself. Indeed, it is on that above all that I seek light. Tell me what you know," he pleaded. "Tell me who I am, who you are, and how our destinies are intermixed. Give me a little help with my life, Miss Vandeleur, only a word or two to guide me, only the name of my father, if you will, and I shall be grateful and content." "I will not attempt to deceive you," she replied. "I know who you are, but I am not at liberty to say. Tell me, at least, that you have forgiven my presumption, and I shall wait with all the patience I have," he said. "If I am not to know, I must do without. It is cruel, but I can bear more upon a push. Only do not add to my troubles the thought that I have made an enemy of you." "You did only what was natural," she said, "and I have nothing to forgive you. Farewell." "Is it to be farewell?" he asked. "Nay, that I do not know myself," she answered. "Farewell for the present, if you like." And with these words she was gone. Francis returned to his lodging in a state of considerable commotion of mind. He made the most trifling progress with his Euclid for that forenoon, and was more often at the window than at his improvised writing table. But beyond seeing the return of Miss Vandeleur and the meeting between her and her father, who was smoking a Trichinopoly cigar in the veranda, there was nothing notable in the neighbourhood of the house with the green blinds before the time of the midday meal. The young man hastily allayed his appetite in a neighbouring restaurant, and returned with the speed of unallayed curiosity to the house in the Rue Lepic. A mounted servant was leading a saddle-horse to and fro before the garden wall, and the porter of Francis's lodging was smoking a pipe against the doorpost, absorbed in contemplation of the livery and the steeds. "Look," he cried to the young man, "what fine cattle! What an elegant costume! They belong to the brother of Monsieur de Vandeleur, who is now within upon a visit. He is a great man, a general in your country, and you doubtless know him well by reputation." "I confess," returned Francis, "that I have never heard of General Vandeleur before. We have many officers of that grade, and my pursuits have been exclusively civil." "It is he," replied the porter, "who lost the great diamond of the Indies. Of that at least you must have read often in the papers." As soon as Francis could disengage himself from the porter, he ran upstairs and hurried to the window. Immediately below the clear space in the chestnut leaves, the two gentlemen were seated in conversation over a cigar. The general, a red, military-looking man, offered some traces of a family resemblance to his brother. He had something of the same features, something, although very little, of the same free and powerful carriage. But he was older, smaller, and more common in air. His likeness was that of a caricature, and he seemed altogether a poor and deeble being by the side of the dictator. They spoke in tones so low, leaning over the table with every appearance of interest, that Francis could catch no more than a word or two on an occasion. For as little as he heard, he was convinced that the conversation turned upon himself and his own career. Several times the name of Scrimgeour reached his ear, for it was easy to distinguish, and still more frequently he fancied he could distinguish the name Francis. At length the general, as if in a hot anger, broke forth into several violent exclamations. "Francis Vandeleur!" he cried, accentuating the last word. "Francis Vandeleur, I tell you." The dictator made a movement of his whole body, half affirmative, half contemptuous, but his answer was inaudible to the young man. Was he the Francis Vandeleur in question? He wondered. Were they discussing the name under which he was to be married? Or was the whole affair a dream and a delusion of his own conceit and self-absorption? After another interval of inaudible talk, dissension seemed again to arise between the couple underneath the chestnut, and again the general raised his voice angrily so as to be audible to Francis. "My wife!" he cried. "I have done with my wife for good. I will not hear her name. I am sick of her very name." And he swore aloud and beat the table with his fist. The dictator appeared by his gestures to pacify him after a paternal fashion, and a little after he conducted him to the garden gate. The pair shook hands affectionately enough, but as soon as the door had closed behind his visitor, John Vandeleur fell into a fit of laughter, which sounded unkindly and even devilish in the ears of Francis Scrymgeour. So another day had passed, and little more learnt. But the young man remembered that the morrow was Tuesday, and promised himself some curious discoveries. All might be well, or all might be ill. He was sure, at least, to glean some curious information, and perhaps by good luck get at the heart of the mystery which surrounded his father and his family. As the hour of the dinner drew near, many preparations were made in the garden of the house with the green blinds. That table, which was partly visible to Francis through the chestnut leaves, was destined to serve as a sideboard, and carried relays of plates and the materials for salad. The other, which was almost entirely concealed, had been set apart for the diners, and Francis could catch glimpses of white cloth and silver plate. Mr. Rolls arrived, punctual to the minute. He looked like a man upon his guard, and spoke low and sparingly. The dictator, on the other hand, appeared to enjoy an unusual flow of spirits. His laugh, which was youthful and pleasant to hear, sounded frequently from the garden. By the modulation and the changes of his voice, it was obvious that he told many droll stories, and imitated the accents of a variety of different nations. And before he and the young clergyman had finished their vermouth, all feeling of distrust was at an end, and they were talking together like a pair of school companions. At length Miss Vandeleur made her appearance, carrying the soup tureen. Mr. Rolls ran to offer her assistance, which she laughingly refused, and there was an interchange of pleasantries among the trio which seemed to have reference to this primitive manner of waiting by one of the company. "One is more at one's ease," Mr. Vandeleur was heard to declare. Next moment they were all three in their places, and Francis could see as little as he could hear of what passed. But the dinner seemed to go merrily. There was a perpetual babble of voices and sound of knives and forks below the chestnut, and Francis, who had no more than a roll to gnaw, was affected with envy by the comfort and deliberation of the meal. The party lingered over one dish after another, and then over a delicate dessert, with a bottle of old wine carefully uncorked by the hand of the dictator himself. As it began to grow dark, a lamp was set upon the table and a couple of candles on the sideboard, for the night was perfectly pure, starry, and windless. Light overflowed besides from the door and window in the veranda, so that the garden was fairly illuminated, and the leaves twinkled in the darkness. For perhaps the 10th time Miss Vandeleur entered the house, and on this occasion she returned with the coffee tray, which she placed upon the sideboard. At the same moment, her father rose from his seat. "The coffee is my province," Francis heard him say. And next moment, he saw his supposed father standing by the sideboard in the light of the candles. Talking over his shoulder all the while, Mr. Vandeleur poured out 2 cups of the brown stimulant, and then, by a rapid act of prestidigitation, emptied the contents of a tiny phial into the smaller of the 2. The thing was so swiftly done that even Francis, who looked straight into his face, had hardly time to perceive the movement before it was completed. And next instant, and still laughing, Mr. Vandeleur had turned again towards the table with a cup in either hand. "Ere we have done with this," said he, "we may expect our famous Hebrew." It would be impossible to depict the confusion and distress of Francis Scrymgeour. He saw foul play going forward before his eyes, and he felt bound to interfere, but knew not how. It might be a mere pleasantry, and then how should he look if he were to offer an unnecessary warning? Or again, if it were serious, the criminal might be his own father, And then how should he not lament if he were to bring ruin on the author of his days? For the first time he became conscious of his own position as a spy. To wait inactive at such a juncture and with such a conflict of sentiments in his bosom was to suffer the most acute torture. He clung to the bars of the shutters, his heart beat fast and with irregularity, and he felt a strong sweat break forth upon his body. Several minutes passed. He seemed to perceive the conversation die away and grow less and less in vivacity and volume, but still no sign of any alarming or even notable event. Suddenly, the ring of a glass breaking was followed by a faint and dull sound, as of a person who should have fallen forward with his head upon the table. At the same moment a piercing scream rose from the garden. "What have you done?" cried Miss Vandeleur. "He is dead," the dictator replied in a violent whisper, so strong and sibilant that every word was audible to the watcher at the window. "Silence," said Mr. Vandeleur. "The man is as well as I am. Take him by the heels whilst I carry him by the shoulders." Francis heard Miss Vandeleur break forth into a passion of tears. "Do you hear what I say?" resumed the dictator in the same tones. "Or do you wish to quarrel with me? I give you your choice, Miss Vandeleur." There was another pause, and the dictator spoke again. "Take that man by the heels," he said. "I must have him brought into the house. If I were a little younger, I could help myself against the world. But now that years and dangers are upon me and my hands are weakened, I must turn to you for aid." "It is a crime," replied the girl. "I am your father," said Mr. Vandeleur. This appeal seemed to produce its effect. A scuffling noise followed upon the gravel, a chair was overset, and then Francis saw the father and daughter stagger across the walk and disappear under the veranda, bearing the inanimate body of Mr. Rolls embraced about the knees and shoulders. The young clergyman was limp and pallid, and his head rolled upon his shoulders at every step. Was he alive or dead? Francis, in spite of the dictator's declaration, inclined to the latter view. A great crime had been committed. A great calamity had fallen upon the inhabitants of the house with the green blinds. To his surprise, Francis found all horror for the deed swallowed up in sorrow for a girl and an old man whom he judged to be in the height of peril. A tide of generous feeling swept into his heart. He too would help his father against man and mankind, against fate and justice. And casting open the shutters, he closed his eyes and threw himself with outstretched arms into the foliage of the chestnut. Branch after branch slipped from his grasp or broke under his weight. Then he caught a stalwart bough under his armpit and hung suspended for a second, and then he let himself drop and fell heavily against the table. A cry of alarm from the house warned him that his entrance had not been effected unobserved. He recovered himself with a stagger and in 3 bounds crossed the intervening space and stood before the door in the veranda. In a small apartment, carpeted with matting and surrounded by glazed cabinets full of rare and costly curios, Mr. Vandeleur was stooping over the body of Mr. Rolls. He raised himself as Francis entered, and there was an instantaneous passage of hands. It was the business of a second. As fast as an eye can wink, the thing was done. The young man had not the time to be sure, but it seemed to him as if the dictator had taken something from the curate's breast, looked at it for the least fraction of time as it lay in his hand, and then suddenly and swiftly passed it to his daughter. All this was over while Francis had still 1 foot upon the threshold and the other raised in air. The next instant he was on his knees to Mr. Vandeleur. "Father," he cried, "let me too help you. I will do what you wish and ask no questions. I will obey you with my life. Treat me as a son, and you will find I have a son's devotion." A deplorable explosion of oaths was the dictator's first reply. "Son and father," he cried. "Father and son! What unnatural comedy is all this? How do you come in my garden? What do you want? And who in God's name are you?" Francis, with a stunned and shamefaced aspect, got upon his feet again and stood in silence. Then a light seemed to break upon Mr. Vandeleur, and he laughed aloud. "I see," cried he. "It is the Scrimgeour. Very well, Mr. Scrimgeour. Let me tell you in a few words how you stand. You have entered my private residence by force, or perhaps by fraud, but certainly with no encouragement from me. And you come at a moment of some annoyance, a guest having fainted at my table, to besiege me with your protestations. You are no son of mine. You are my brother's bastard by a fishwife, if you want to know. I regard you with an indifference closely bordering on aversion, and from what I now see of your conduct, I judge your mind to be exactly suitable to your exterior. I recommend you these mortifying reflections for your leisure, and in the meantime, let me beseech you to rid us of your presence. If I were not occupied, added the dictator with a terrifying oath, I should give you the unholiest drubbing ere you went. Francis listened in profound humiliation. He would have fled had it been possible, but as he had no means of leaving the residence into which he had so unfortunately penetrated, he could do no more than stand foolishly where he was. It was Miss Vandeleur who broke the silence. "Father," she said, "you speak in anger. Mr. Scrimgeour may have been mistaken, but he meant well and kindly." "Thank you for speaking," returned the dictator. "You remind me of some other observations which I hold it a point of honor to make to Mr. Scrimgeour. My brother," he continued, addressing the young man, "has been foolish enough to give you an allowance. He was foolish enough and presumptuous enough to propose a match between you and this young lady. You were exhibited to her 2 nights ago, and I rejoice to tell you that she rejected the idea with disgust. Let me add that I have considerable influence with your father, and it shall not be my fault if you are not beggared of your allowance and sent back to your scrivening ere the week be out." The tones of the old man's voice were, if possible, more wounding than his language. Francis felt himself exposed to the most cruel, blighting, and unbearable contempt. His head turned, and he covered his face with his hands, uttering at the same time a tearless sob of agony. But Miss Vandeleur once again interfered in his behalf. "Mr. Scrimgeour," she said, speaking in clear and even tones, "you must not be concerned at my father's harsh expressions. I felt no disgust for you. On the contrary, I asked an opportunity to make your better acquaintance. As for what has passed tonight, believe me, it has filled my mind with both pity and esteem." Just then, Mr. Rolls made a convulsive movement with his arm, which convinced Francis that he was only drugged and was beginning to throw off the influence of the opiate. Mr. Vandeleur stooped over him and examined his face for an instant. "Come, come," cried he, raising his head. "Let there be an end of this. And since you are so pleased with his conduct, Miss Vandeleur, take a candle and show the bastard out." The young lady hastened to obey. "Thank you," said Francis as soon as he was alone with her in the garden. "I thank you from my soul. This has been the bitterest evening of my life, but it will have always one pleasant recollection." "I spoke as I felt," she replied, "and in justice to you. It made my heart sorry that you should be so unkindly used." By this time they had reached the garden gate, and Miss Vandeleur, having set the candle on the ground, was already unfastening the bolts. "One word more," said Francis. "This is not for the last time. I shall see you again, shall I not?" "Alas," she answered, "you have heard my father. What can I do but obey?" "Tell me at least that it is not with your consent," returned Francis. "Tell me that you have no wish to see the last of me." "Indeed," replied she, "I have none. You seem to me both brave and honest." "Then," said Francis, "give me a keepsake." She paused for a moment with her hand upon the key, for the various bars and bolts were all undone, and there was nothing left but to open the lock. "If I agree," she said, "will you promise to do as I tell you from point to point?" "Can you ask?" replied Francis. "I would do so willingly on your bare word." She turned the key and threw open the door. "Be it so," said she. "You do not know what you ask, but be it so. Whatever you hear," she continued, "whatever happens, do not return to this house. Hurry fast until you reach the lighted and populous quarters of the city. Even there be upon your guard. You are in a greater danger than you fancy. Promise me you will not so much as look at my keepsake until you are in a place of safety." "I promise," replied Francis. She put something loosely wrapped in a handkerchief into the young man's hand, and at the same time, with more strength than he could have anticipated, she pushed him into the street. "Now run!" she cried. He heard the door close behind him, and the noise of the bolts being replaced. "My faith," said he, "since I have promised." And he took to his heels down the lane that leads into the Rue Ravignon. He was not 50 paces from the house with the green blinds, when the most diabolical outcry suddenly arose out of the stillness of the night. Mechanically he stood still. Another passenger followed his example. In the neighbouring floors he saw people crowding to the windows. A conflagration could not have produced more disturbance in this empty quarter. And yet it seemed to be all the work of a single man, roaring between grief and rage, like a lioness robbed of her whelps. And Francis was surprised and alarmed to hear his own name shouted with English imprecations to the wind. His first movement was to return to the house, his second, as he remembered Miss Vandeleur's advice, to continue his flight with greater expedition than before, and he was in the act of turning to put his thought in action, when the dictator, bareheaded, bawling aloud, his white hair blowing about his head, shot past him like a ball out of the cannon's mouth and went careering down the street. That was a close shave, thought Francis to himself. What he wants with me, and why he should be so disturbed, I cannot think. But he is plainly not good company for the moment, and I cannot do better than follow Miss Vandeleur's advice. So saying, he turned to retrace his steps, thinking to double and descend by the Rue Lepic itself, while his pursuer should continue to follow after him on the other line of street. The plan was ill-devised. As a matter of fact, he should have taken his seat in the nearest café, and waited there until the first heat of the pursuit was over. But besides that Francis had no experience and little natural aptitude for the small war of private life, he was so unconscious of any evil on his part that he saw nothing to fear beyond a disagreeable interview. And to disagreeable interviews, he felt he had already served his apprenticeship that evening. Nor could he suppose that Miss Vandeleur had left anything unsaid. Indeed, the young man was sore both in body and mind. The one was all bruised, the other was full of smarting arrows, and he owned to himself that Mr. Vandeleur was master of a very deadly tongue. The thought of his bruises reminded him that he had not only come without a hat, but that his clothes had considerably suffered in his descent through the chestnut. At the first magazine he purchased a cheap wide-awake and had the disorder of his toilet summarily repaired. The keepsake, still rolled in the handkerchief, he thrust in the meanwhile into his trousers pocket. Not many steps beyond the shop he was conscious of a sudden shock, a hand upon his throat, an infuriated face close to his own, and an open mouth bawling curses in his ear. The dictator, having found no trace of his quarry, was returning by the other way. Francis was a stalwart young fellow, but he was no match for his adversary, whether in strength or skill, and after a few ineffectual struggles, he resigned himself entirely to his captor. "What do you want with me?" said he. "We will talk of that at home," returned the dictator grimly, and he continued to march the young man uphill in the direction of the house with the green blinds. But Francis, although he no longer struggled, was only waiting an opportunity to make a bold push for freedom. With a sudden jerk, he left the collar of his coat in the hands of Mr. Vandeleur, and once more made off at his best speed in the direction of the boulevards. The tables were now turned. If the dictator was the stronger, Francis, in the top of his youth, was the more fleet of foot, and he had soon effected his escape among the crowds. Relieved for a moment, but with a growing sentiment of alarm and wonder in his mind, he walked briskly until he debouched upon the Place de l'Opéra, lit up like day with electric lamps. This, at least, thought he, should satisfy Miss Vandeleur. And turning to his right along the boulevards, he entered the Café Américain and ordered some beer. It was both late and early for the majority of the frequenters of the establishment. Only 2 or 3 persons, all men, were dotted here and there at separate tables in the hall, and Francis was too much occupied by his own thoughts to observe their presence. He drew the handkerchief from his pocket. The object wrapped in it proved to be a morocco case, clasped and ornamented in gilt, which opened by means of a spring, and disclosed to the horrified young man a diamond of monstrous bigness and extraordinary brilliancy. The circumstance was so inexplicable, the value of the stone was plainly so enormous, that Francis sat staring into the open casket without movement, without conscious thought, like a man stricken suddenly with idiocy. A hand was laid upon his shoulder, lightly but firmly, and a quiet voice, which yet had in it the ring of command, uttered these words in his ear: "Close the casket and compose your face." Looking up, he beheld a man still young, of an urbane and tranquil presence, and dressed with rich simplicity. This personage had risen from a neighbouring table, and bringing his glass with him, had taken a seat beside Francis. "Close the casket," repeated the stranger, "and put it quietly back into your pocket, where I feel persuaded it should never have been. Try, if you please, to throw off your bewildered air and act as though I were one of your acquaintances whom you had met by chance. So, Touch glasses with me. That is better. I fear, sir, you must be an amateur." And the stranger pronounced these last words with a smile of peculiar meaning, leaned back in his seat, and enjoyed a deep inhalation of tobacco. "For God's sake," said Francis, "tell me who you are and what this means. Why I should obey your most unusual suggestions, I'm sure I know not. But the truth is, I have fallen this evening into so many perplexing adventures, and all I meet conduct themselves so strangely, that I think I must either have gone mad or wandered into another planet. Your face inspires me with confidence. You seem wise, good, and experienced. Tell me, for heaven's sake, why you accost me in so odd a fashion." "All in due time," replied the stranger, "but I have the first hand, and you must begin by telling me how the Rajah's diamond is in your possession." "The Rajah's diamond!" echoed Francis. "I would not speak so loud if I were you," returned the other, "but most certainly you have the Rajah's diamond in your pocket. I have seen and handled it a score of times in Sir Thomas Vandeleur's collection." "Sir Thomas Vandeleur! The General! My father!" cried Francis. "Your father?" repeated the stranger. "I was not aware the General had any family." "I am illegitimate, sir," replied Francis with a flush. The other bowed with gravity. It was a respectful bow, as of a man silently apologizing to his equal, and Francis felt relieved and comforted, he scarce knew why. The society of this person did him good. He seemed to touch firm ground. A strong feeling of respect grew up in his bosom, and mechanically he removed his wide-awake as though in the presence of a superior. "I perceive," said the stranger, "that your adventures have not all been peaceful. Your collar is torn, your face is scratched, you have a cut upon your temple. You will perhaps pardon my curiosity when I ask you to explain how you came by these injuries, and how you happen to have stolen property to an enormous value in your pocket." "I must differ from you," returned Francis hotly. "I possess no stolen property, and if you refer to the diamond, it was given to me not an hour ago by Miss Vandeleur in the Rue Lepic." "By Miss Vandeleur of the Rue Lepic," repeated the other. "You interest me more than you suppose. Pray continue." "Heavens!" cried Francis. His memory had made a sudden bound. He had seen Mr. Vandeleur take an article from the breast of his drugged visitor, and that article, he was now persuaded, was a Morocco case. "You have a light?" inquired the stranger. "Listen," replied Francis. "I know not who you are, but I believe you to be worthy of confidence and helpful. I find myself in strange waters. I must have counsel and support, and since you invite me, I shall tell you all." And he briefly recounted his experiences since the day when he was summoned from the bank by his lawyer. "Yours is indeed a remarkable history," said the stranger, after the young man had made an end of his narrative, "and your position is full of difficulty and peril. Many would counsel you to seek out your father and give the diamond to him, but I have other views." "Waiter," he cried. The waiter drew near. "Will you ask the manager to speak with me a moment?" said he, and Francis observed once more, both in his tone and manner, the evidence of a habit of command. The waiter withdrew, and returned in a moment with manager, who bowed with obsequious respect. "What," said he, "can I do to serve you?" "Have the goodness," replied the stranger, indicating Francis, "to tell this gentleman my name." "You have the honour, sir," said the functionary, addressing young Scrimgeour, "to occupy the same table with His Highness Prince Florizel of Bohemia." Francis rose with precipitation, and made a grateful reverence to the prince, who bade him resume his seat. "I thank you," said Florizel, once more addressing the functionary. "I am sorry to have deranged you for so small a matter," and he dismissed him with a movement of his hand. "And now," added the prince, turning to Francis, "give me the diamond." Without a word, the casket was handed over. "You have done right," said Florizel. "Your sentiments have properly inspired you, and you will live to be grateful for the misfortunes of tonight. A man, Mr. Scrimgeour, may fall into 1,000 perplexities, but if his heart be upright and his intelligence unclouded, he will issue from them all without dishonour. Let your mind be at rest. Your affairs are in my hand, and with the aid of heaven I am strong enough to bring them to a good end. Follow me, if you please, to my carriage." So saying, the prince arose and, having left a piece of gold for the waiter, conducted the young man from the café and along the boulevard to where an unpretentious brougham and a couple of servants out of livery awaited his arrival. "This carriage," said he, "is at your disposal. Collect your baggage as rapidly as you can make it convenient, and my servants will conduct you to a villa in the neighborhood of Paris where you can wait in some degree of comfort until I have had time to arrange your situation. You will find there a pleasant garden, a library of good authors, a cook, a cellar, and some good cigars, which I recommend to your attention. Jerome, he added, turning to one of the servants, you have heard what I say. I leave Mr. Scrimgeour in your charge. You will, I know, be careful of my friend. Francis uttered some broken phrases of gratitude. It will be time enough to thank me, said the prince, when you are acknowledged by your father and married to Miss Vandeleur. And with that the prince turned away and strolled leisurely in the direction of Montmartre. He hailed the first passing cab, gave an address, and a quarter of an hour afterwards, having discharged the driver some distance lower, he was knocking at Mr. Vandeleur's garden gate. It was opened with singular precautions by the dictator in person. "Who are you?" he demanded. "You must pardon me this late visit, Mr. Vandeleur," replied the prince. "Your Highness is always welcome," returned Mr. Vandeleur, stepping back. The prince profited by the open space, and without waiting for his host, walked right into the house and opened the door of the salon. Two people were seated there. One was Miss Vandeleur, who bore the marks of weeping about her eyes, and was still shaken from time to time by a sob. In the other, the prince recognized the young man who had consulted him on literary matters about a month before, in a club smoking room. "Good evening, Miss Vandeleur," said Florizel. "You look fatigued. Mr. Rolls, I believe. I hope you have profited by the study of Gaboriau, Mr. Rolls." But the young clergyman's temper was too much embittered for speech, and he contented himself with bowing stiffly and continued to gnaw his lip. "To what good wind," said Mr. Vandeleur, following his guest, "am I to attribute the honour of your Highness's presence?" "I am come on business," returned the prince, "on business with you. As soon as that is settled, I shall request Mr. Rolls to accompany me for a walk. Mr. Rolls," he added with severity, "let me remind you that I have not yet sat down." The clergyman sprang to his feet with an apology, whereupon the prince took an armchair beside the table, handed his hat to Mr. Vandeleur, his cane to Mr. Rolls, and leaving them standing and thus menially employed upon his service, spoke as follows. "I have come here, as I said, upon business, but had I come looking for pleasure, I could not have been more displeased with my reception, nor more dissatisfied with my company. You, sir," addressing Mr. Rolls, "you have treated your superior in station with discourtesy. You, Vandeleur, receive me with a smile, but you know right well that your hands are not yet cleansed from misconduct. I do not desire to be interrupted, sir," he added imperiously. "I am here to speak and not to listen, and I have to ask you to hear me with respect and to obey punctiliously. At the earliest possible date, your daughter shall be married at the embassy to my friend, Francis Scrimgeour, your brother's acknowledged son. You will oblige me by offering not less than £10,000 dowry. For yourself, I will indicate to you in writing a mission of some importance in Siam, which I destine to your care. And now, sir, you will answer me in 2 words whether or not you agree to these conditions." "Your Highness will pardon me," said Mr. Vandeleur, "and permit me, with all respect, to submit to him 2 queries." "The permission is granted," replied the prince. "Your Highness," resumed the dictator, "has called Mr. Scrimgeour his friend. Believe me, had I known he was thus honoured, I should have treated him with proportional respect." "You interrogate adroitly," said the prince, "but it will not serve your turn. You have my commands. If I had never seen that gentleman before tonight, it would not render them less absolute." "Your Highness interprets my meaning with his usual subtlety," returned Vandeleur. "Once more, I have, unfortunately, put the police upon the track of Mr. Scrimgeour on a charge of theft. Am I to withdraw or to uphold the accusation?" "You will please yourself," replied Florizel. "The question is one between your conscience and the laws of this land. Give me my hat, and you, Mr. Rolls, give me my cane and follow me. Miss Vandeleur, I wish you good evening. I judge," he added to Vandeleur, "that your silence means unqualified assent." "If I can do no better," replied the old man, "I shall submit. But I warn you openly it shall not be without a struggle." "You are old," said the prince, "but years are disgraceful to the wicked. Your age is more unwise than the youth of others. Do not provoke me, or you may find me harder than you dream. This is the first time that I have fallen across your path in anger. Take care that it be the last." With these words, motioning the clergyman to follow, Florizel left the apartment and directed his steps towards the garden gate. And the dictator, following with a candle, gave them light, and once more undid the elaborate fastenings with which he sought to protect himself from intrusion. "Your daughter is no longer present," said the prince, turning on the threshold. "Let me tell you that I understand your threats, and you have only to lift your hand to bring upon yourself sudden and irremediable ruin." The dictator made no reply, but as the prince turned his back upon him in the lamplight, he made a gesture full of menace and insane fury, and the next moment, slipping round a corner, he was running at full speed for the nearest cab stand. "Here," says my Arabian, "the thread of events is finally diverted from the house with the green blinds. One more adventure," he adds, "and we have done with the Rajah's diamond." That last link in the chain is known among the inhabitants of Baghdad by the name of The Adventure of Prince Florizel and a Detective. The Adventure of Prince Florizel and a Detective. Prince Florizel walked with Mr. Rolls to the door of a small hotel where the latter resided. They spoke much together, and the clergyman was more than once affected to tears by the mingled severity and tenderness of Florizel's reproaches. "I have made ruin of my life," he said at last. "Help me. Tell me what I am to do. I have, alas, neither the virtues of a priest nor the dexterity of a rogue." "Now that you are humbled," said the prince, "I command no longer. The repentant have to do with God and not with princes. But if you will let me advise you, go to Australia as a colonist, seek menial labour in the open air, and try to forget that you have ever been a clergyman, or that you ever set eyes on that accursed stone." "Accursed indeed," replied Mr. Rolls. "Where is it now? What further hurt is it not working for mankind?" "It will do no more evil," returned the prince. "It is here in my pocket. And this," he added kindly, "will show that I place some faith in your penitence, young as it is." "Suffer me to touch your hand," pleaded Mr. Rolls. "No," replied Prince Florizel, "not yet." The tone in which he uttered these last words was eloquent in the ears of the young clergyman, and for some minutes after the prince had turned away, he stood on the threshold, following with his eyes the retreating figure and invoking the blessing of heaven upon a man so excellent in counsel. For several hours the prince walked alone in unfrequented streets. His mind was full of concern. What to do with the diamond, whether to return it to its owner, whom he judged unworthy of this rare possession, or to take some sweeping and courageous measure and put it out of the reach of all mankind at once and forever, was a problem too grave to be decided in a moment. The manner in which it had come into his hands appeared manifestly providential, and as he took out the jewel and looked at it under the street lamps, its size and surprising brilliancy inclined him more and more to think of it as of an unmixed and dangerous evil for the world. "God help me," he thought. "If I look at it much oftener, I shall begin to grow covetous myself." At last, though still uncertain in his mind, he turned his steps towards the small but elegant mansion on the riverside, which had belonged for centuries to his royal family. The arms of Bohemia are deeply graved over the door and upon the tall chimneys. Passengers have a look into a green court set with the most costly flowers, and a stork, the only one in Paris, perches on the gable all day long and keeps a crowd before the house. Grave servants are seen passing to and fro within, and from time to time the great gate is thrown open and a carriage rolls below the arch. For many reasons, this residence was especially dear to the heart of Prince Florizel. He never drew near to it without enjoying that sentiment of homecoming so rare in the lives of the great, and on the present evening he beheld its tall roof and mildly illuminated windows with unfeigned relief and satisfaction. As he was approaching the postern door by which he always entered when alone, a man stepped forth from the shadow and presented himself with an obeisance in the prince's path. "I have the honour of addressing Prince Florizel of Bohemia," said he. "Such is my title," replied the prince. "What do you want with me?" "I am," said the man, "a detective, and I have to present your highness with this billet from the prefect of police." The prince took the letter and glanced it through by the light of the street lamp. It was highly apologetic, but requested him to follow the bearer to the prefecture without delay. "In short," said Florizel, "I am arrested." "Your highness," replied the officer, Nothing, I am certain, could be further from the intention of the prefect. You will observe that he has not granted a warrant. It is mere formality, or call it, if you prefer, an obligation that your Highness lays on the authorities. At the same time, asked the prince, if I were to refuse to follow you? I will not conceal from your Highness that a considerable discretion has been granted me, replied the detective with a bow. Upon my word, cried Florizel, your effrontery astounds me. Yourself as an agent I must pardon, but your superiors shall dearly smart for their misconduct. What, have you any idea, is the cause of this impolitic and unconstitutional act? You will observe that I have as yet neither refused nor consented, and much may depend on your prompt and ingenuous answer. Let me remind you, officer, that this is an affair of some gravity. Your Highness, said the detective humbly, General Vandeleur and his brother have had the incredible presumption to accuse you of theft. The famous diamond, they declare, is in your hands. A word from you in denial will most amply satisfy the prefect. Nay, I go farther. If your Highness would so far honour a subaltern as to declare his ignorance of the matter even to myself, I should ask permission to retire upon the spot. Florizel, up to the last moment, had regarded his adventure in the light of a trifle, only serious upon international considerations. At the name of Vandeleur, the horrible truth broke upon him in a moment. He was not only arrested, but he was guilty. This was not only an annoying incident, it was a peril to his honour. What was he to say? What was he to do? The Rajah's diamond was indeed an accursed stone, and it seemed as if he were to be the last victim to its influence. One thing was certain. He could not give the required assurance to the detective. He must gain time. His hesitation had not lasted a second. Be it so, said he. Let us walk together to the prefecture. The man once more bowed, and proceeded to follow Florizel at a respectful distance in the rear. Approach, said the prince. I am in a humour to talk, and if I mistake not, now I look at you again, this is not the first time that we have met. I count it an honour, replied the officer, that your Highness should recollect my face. It is 8 years since I had the pleasure of an interview. To remember faces, returned Florizel, is as much a part of my profession as it is of yours. Indeed, rightly looked upon, a prince and a detective serve in the same corps. We are both combatants against crime, only mine is the more lucrative, and yours the more dangerous rank, and there is a sense in which both may be made equally honourable to a good man. I had rather, strange as you may think it, be a detective of character and parts than a weak and ignoble sovereign. The officer was overwhelmed. Your Highness returns good for evil, said he. To an act of presumption he replies by the most amiable condescension. How do you know, replied Florizel, that I am not seeking to corrupt you? Heaven preserve me from the temptation, cried the detective. I applaud your answer, returned the prince. It is that of a wise and honest man. The world is a great place and stocked with wealth and beauty, and there is no limit to the rewards that may be offered. Such an one who would refuse $1 million of money may sell his honour for an empire or the love of a woman. And I myself, who speak to you, have seen occasions so tempting, provocations so irresistible to the strength of human virtue, that I have been glad to tread in your steps and recommend myself to the grace of God. It is thus, thanks to that modest and becoming habit alone, he added, that you and I can walk this town together with untarnished hearts. I had always heard that you were brave, replied the officer, but I was not aware that you were wise and pious. You speak the truth, and you speak it with an accent that moves me to the heart. This world is indeed a place of trial. We are now, said Florizel, in the middle of the bridge. Lean your elbows on the parapet and look over. As the water rushing below, so the passions and complications of life carry away the honesty of weak men. Let me tell you a story. I receive your Highness's commands, replied the man, and, imitating the prince, he leaned against the parapet and disposed himself to listen. The city was already sunk in slumber. Had it not been for the infinity of lights and the outline of buildings on the starry sky, they might have been alone beside some country river. An officer, began Prince Florizel, a man of courage and conduct, who had already risen by merit to an eminent rank, and won not only admiration but respect, visited, in an unfortunate hour for his peace of mind, the collections of an Indian prince. Here he beheld a diamond so extraordinary for size and beauty that from that instant he had only one desire in life: honor, reputation, friendship, the love of country. He was ready to sacrifice all for this lump of sparkling crystal. For 3 years he served this semi-barbarian potentate as Jacob served Laban. He falsified frontiers, he connived at murders, he unjustly condemned and executed a brother officer who had the misfortune to displease the Rajah by some honest freedoms. Lastly, at a time of great danger to his native land, he betrayed a body of his fellow soldiers and suffered them to be defeated and massacred by thousands. In the end, he had amassed a magnificent fortune and brought home with him the coveted diamond. Years passed, continued the prince, and at length the diamond is accidentally lost. It falls into the hands of a simple and laborious youth, a student, a minister of God, just entering on a career of usefulness and even distinction. Upon him also the spell is cast. He deserts everything, his holy calling, his studies, and flees with the gem into a foreign country. The officer has a brother, an astute, daring, unscrupulous man who learns the clergyman's secret. What does he do? Tell his brother, inform the police? No. Upon this man also the satanic charm has fallen. He must have the stone for himself. At the risk of murder, he drugs the young priest and seizes the prey. And now, by an accident which is not important to my moral, the jewel passes out of his custody into that of another, who, terrified at what he sees, gives it into the keeping of a man in high station and above reproach. The officer's name is Thomas Vandeleur, continued Florizel. The stone is called the Rajah's diamond, and, suddenly opening his hand, you behold it here before your eyes. The officer started back with a cry. We have spoken of corruption, said the prince. To me, this nugget of bright crystal is as loathsome as though it were crawling with the worms of death. It is as shocking as though it were compacted out of innocent blood. I see it here in my hand, and I know it is shining with hellfire. I have told you but 100th part of its story, what passed in former ages, to what crimes and treacheries it incited men of yore, the imagination trembles to conceive. For years and years it has faithfully served the powers of hell. Enough, I say, of blood, enough of disgrace, enough of broken lives and friendships. All things come to an end, the evil like the good, pestilence as well as beautiful music. And as for this diamond, God forgive me if I do wrong, but its empire ends tonight. The prince made a sudden movement with his hand, and the jewel, describing an arc of light, dived with a splash into the flowing river. Amen, said Florizel with gravity. I have slain a cockatrice. God pardon me, cried the detective. What have you done? I am a ruined man. I think, returned the prince with a smile, that many well-to-do people in this city might envy you your ruin. Alas, your highness, said the officer, and you corrupt me after all. It seems there was no help for it, replied Florizel, and now let us go forward to the prefecture. Not long after, the marriage of Francis Scrimgeour and Miss Vandeleur was celebrated in great privacy, and the prince acted on that occasion as groomsman. The two Vandeleurs surprised some rumour of what had happened to the diamond, and their vast diving operations on the River Seine are the wonder and amusement of the idle. It is true that through some miscalculation they have chosen the wrong branch of the river. As for the prince, that sublime person, having now served his turn, may go, along with the Arabian author, topsy-turvy into space. But if the reader insists on more specific information, I am happy to say that a recent revolution hurled him from the throne of Bohemia in consequence of his continued absence and edifying neglect of public business, and that His Highness now keeps a cigar store in Rupert Street, much frequented by other foreign refugees. I go there from time to smoke and have a chat, and find him as great a creature as in the days of his prosperity. He has an Olympian air behind the counter, and although a sedentary life is beginning to tell upon his waistcoat, he is probably, take him for all in all, the handsomest tobacconist in London. Thank you for listening. If you like our recordings, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel so you don't miss any more audiobooks.